Malcolm stood in the tea aisle holding a box of ginger lemon tea he had no intention of buying. Not because he liked ginger tea. He actually hated the taste. Too sharp. Too earthy. It always reminded him of medicine somebody tried to sweeten badly. Still, there he was at nearly 10 o'clock on a Thursday night, inside a Kroger off Ponce de Leon, staring at the same yellow box long enough for another shopper to notice. A woman pushing a cart slowed beside him and smiled. "You gonna grab it?" she asked. "Or just emotionally process it?" Malcolm blinked, caught off guard, then laughed once through his nose. "Sorry," he muttered. "Didn't realize I'd been standing here that long." "Happens to the best of us," the woman said, before rolling away toward produce. Malcolm looked back down at the tea in his hand. That was when it hit him. Zarya used to drink this exact brand whenever she couldn't sleep. Not occasionally, religiously, especially during heavy weeks at work when one of her teenage clients relapsed or disappeared for a few days or stopped answering calls. She used to stand barefoot in the kitchen around midnight, holding steaming mugs with both hands, while old gospel music played quietly from her phone speaker. Sometimes she drank the tea, without even turning lights on, just standing there in the dark kitchen half awake. Malcolm swallowed hard, and placed the tea back on the shelf, a little too carefully. Divorce does strange things to memory. People think grief arrives through major anniversaries or dramatic reminders. It doesn't. Sometimes it's a grocery aisle, a scent, a receipt folded inside an old jacket pocket, a toothpaste brand. You keep buying out of habit 2 years after the other person moved out. The worst part was that Malcolm still couldn't clearly explain when the marriage actually ended. There was no cheating, no screaming, no dishes thrown against walls. Zarya hadn't stormed out crying with suitcases while neighbors watched through blinds. She left the same way she loved him most of the time. Quietly, and somehow that silence stayed with him longer than anger would have. Malcolm grabbed a basket and kept walking slowly through the store, but his chest felt heavier now. A young couple stood near frozen foods debating pizza brands while their toddler tried climbing out of the cart seat. An exhausted cashier rubbed her shoulder between customers. Somewhere near the pharmacy aisle, somebody laughed too loudly at something on speakerphone. Ordinary life. That was the part nobody prepared you for after divorce. The world refused to pause with you. Your heartbreak still had to exist beside people buying cereal and allergy medicine. Malcolm stopped near refrigerated drinks and checked his phone out of instinct. No messages. Mostly, there hadn't been messages for a long time now. At 39 years old, Malcolm Avery had built the kind of life people congratulated constantly. Senior project manager at a respected Atlanta architecture firm. Tailored suits, clean condo in Midtown, good credit, good salary. The kind of man relatives described as doing well for himself. But standing there under grocery store lights holding a basket with almond milk and microwave soup inside it, Malcolm felt the kind of lonely nobody advertises. Not dramatic, lonely, functional lonely. The kind where you still answer emails on time and make dentist appointments while quietly realizing nobody asks how your day actually went anymore. He moved toward checkout lanes, but his mind stayed stuck on Zarya. Not even on the divorce itself. On smaller things. The way she used to touch his wrist twice in crowded places whenever she wanted his attention. The way she hummed while reading. How she always forgot where she left her glasses even though they usually sat on top of her head. Little things. Tiny things. Marriage, Malcolm eventually learned, doesn't disappear all at once. It leaves in pieces so small you barely notice what's missing until ordinary moments start feeling wrong. By the time Malcolm reached self-checkout, he was barely paying attention. Unexpected item in bagging area. The machine announced flatly. "Yeah," Malcolm muttered under his breath. "Story of my life." The woman at the next register laughed softly. He smiled politely without looking up. That had become another habit lately. Polite smiling. Short conversations. Controlled interactions. He was good at those. Always had been. Even as a kid. Especially as a kid. By the time he walked outside, Atlanta air pressed warm and damp against his skin. Traffic moved steadily down Ponce, while distant sirens echoed somewhere farther into the city. Malcolm loaded groceries into the trunk and sat behind the wheel without starting the car immediately. The silence inside felt familiar. Too familiar. That was the thing about certain endings. You don't notice the damage while it's happening because nothing explodes. No single moment announces itself as the final wound. A marriage can suffocate slowly under years of careful conversations, swallowed opinions, public performances, private compromises, and tiny betrayals nobody else sees. And Malcolm still wasn't fully sure which moment finally broke them. Maybe that was why the silence haunted him, because he couldn't point to one disaster. Only accumulation, only distance, only the terrible realization that somebody can love you deeply while slowly feeling less safe around you. He rested both hands against the steering wheel and closed his eyes briefly. Then his phone buzzed suddenly in the cup holder. Nadine, his cousin. Malcolm answered. "You alive?" She asked immediately. "Depends who's asking." "You still doing that thing where you sit in parking lots too long thinking about your life?" Malcolm looked through the windshield toward the glowing grocery store sign. "Maybe." Nadine sighed dramatically. "Boy, you are one jazz album away from becoming somebody's divorced uncle who starts giving life advice nobody requested." Despite himself, Malcolm laughed. It felt good, small, but good. "You ate dinner yet?" she asked. "Just left the store." "Well, Mama asking if you coming Sunday, and before you say no, she already made enough food for 6 people like she, preparing for the apocalypse." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Aunt Denise still putting raisins in potato salad?" "That woman fears seasoning emotionally." He laughed again, this time longer, and for a brief second, the heaviness loosened. But after the call ended, and silence returned to the car, Zarya drifted back into his thoughts almost immediately. Not because he wanted to suffer. Because some people remain emotionally present long after they stop physically sharing your life. Malcolm finally started the engine. Rain tapped lightly against the windshield. Soft at first, almost gentle. And as traffic pulled him slowly through Atlanta streets, glowing under wet headlights and neon signs, Malcolm found himself thinking about the first time he ever met her. Back before the silence, back before the ultimatum, back before he understood how easy it was to lose something good while convincing yourself you were protecting it. Welcome to Mr. Gerald Family. To every single person listening right now, thank you for being here. This channel is growing because of people like you who truly love emotional, unforgettable storytelling. If stories filled with forbidden love, dangerous men, deep passion, heartbreak, secrets, and suspense make your heart race, then you are part of this family. My promise to you is simple. With every new upload, I will work harder to bring you better stories, stronger emotions, deeper characters, and more soul-stirring moments that keep you completely hooked from beginning to end. This is more than just a storytelling channel. It's a place where we escape into powerful stories together, feel every emotion together, and experience unforgettable journeys together. Please support the channel by subscribing as we grow toward 1,000 subscribers. Every like, every comment, and every subscription means more than you know. Your support inspires me to keep improving and deliver even more addictive stories that leave you breathless. Now let's dive in. Malcolm Avery learned early that adults relaxed faster around children who knew how to make themselves smaller, not physically smaller, quieter smaller, safer smaller. By 11 years old, he already understood there were versions of himself certain people preferred. His mother, Corinne, never explained it directly at first. She didn't sit him down with speeches about race or class or presentation. Black parents from her generation rarely had the luxury of turning survival lessons into emotional conversations. They taught through correction, through timing, through small warnings folded into ordinary days. Pull your hoodie down before we go in there. Speak clearly. Don't cut your eyes at people while they talking. Fix your face. Little things. Tiny adjustments repeated often enough to become instinct. Back then, Malcolm and his parents lived in a faded apartment complex off Cascade Road on Atlanta's west side. The buildings weren't dangerous exactly, but everything looked tired. Rusted balcony rails, cracked sidewalks, laundry room machines that stole quarters half the time. Summer heat stayed trapped inside those apartments long after sunset. Corinne worked overnight shifts at Grady Memorial Hospital almost Malcolm's entire childhood. 12-hour shifts that stretched longer whenever staffing got short, which happened often. Some mornings Malcolm woke up before school and found her asleep at the kitchen table still wearing scrubs, forehead resting against folded arms beside unopened mail. Bills usually sat nearby: light bill, water bill, medical payments for Malcolm's father's diabetes medication. Everything in that apartment carried some level of financial tension, even silence, especially silence. His father drove MARTA buses most of Malcolm's childhood, before diabetes started affecting his vision badly enough to force shorter routes and eventually retirement. Walter Avery rarely complained directly. That almost made things heavier. He carried exhaustion quietly, slowly. The television stayed on most evenings, mostly because nobody wanted to hear the apartment settling around them. One night when Malcolm was 13, he walked into the kitchen and found Corinne scrubbing already cleaned counters aggressively, while a stack of overdue notices sat beside the microwave. "You okay?" he asked carefully. Corinne didn't stop wiping. "I'm fine," which in their house usually meant the opposite. Malcolm leaned against the doorway awkwardly. "You need help with something?" His mother finally stopped moving and looked at him. "You know what people notice first about boys like you?" Malcolm frowned slightly. "What boys?" "Smart black boys." He shrugged. "I don't know." Corinne folded the rag carefully over the sink divider. "They decide whether your intelligence makes them comfortable." He stared at her, confused. She continued before he could answer. "If people think you angry, loud, difficult, too confident, too anything." She shook her head slightly. "You won't get the same grace other children get." That word stayed with him. Grace. At school, Malcolm learned exactly what she meant. Teachers praised him constantly, but the praise always sounded strangely surprised. So articulate, so mature, not like the other boys. Malcolm noticed early that white teachers smiled harder when he softened his voice, when he laughed politely instead of loudly, when he avoided slang, when he looked harmless. By middle school, he had already started studying himself from outside his own body, monitoring, editing. He changed how he pronounced words depending on the room, pretended not to recognize certain rap songs around teachers, laughed half a second later than everybody else sometimes, just to check whether the joke was safe first. The strange part was how quickly the performance became automatic. At 14, Malcolm got accepted into a magnet program across town, filled mostly with wealthier students. That was where the real editing began. The first week there, another student named Trevor looked genuinely shocked hearing Malcolm mention living near Cascade. "Wait," Trevor said during lunch. "For real?" Malcolm smiled lightly, like the question didn't bother him. "Yeah." Trevor blinked. "Huh." That was it. Just one small reaction. But Malcolm spent the rest of lunch suddenly aware of everything. His shoes, his accent, his lunch container, the way he held his fork. Shame rarely enters dramatically. Sometimes it arrives through observation. After that, Malcolm started asking Corinne for specific clothes before school dances and competitions. Nothing flashy, just cleaner, safer, things that made him feel less noticeable. Corinne noticed immediately, of course. Mothers usually do. One Saturday, she drove him to a department store near Greenbrier Mall, using money Malcolm knew they shouldn't really spend. While he tried on button-down shirts, Corinne sat quietly in the fitting area, watching him study himself in mirrors too carefully for a 15-year-old boy. "You know you don't gotta become somebody else in order to succeed," she said eventually. Malcolm adjusted the collar again. "I know." But even then, part of him already believed otherwise. By college, Malcolm had become excellent at adaptation, not fake. That's what complicated everything. He wasn't pretending exactly. He was selecting, highlighting safer pieces of himself depending on environment. Around professors, he became polished and measured. Around neighborhood friends, he lowered his voice and relaxed his posture again. At internships, he mastered professional laughter, the controlled kind that never sounded too loud or too familiar. People rewarded him constantly for it. That was the dangerous part. The world often rewards survival habits before asking what they cost emotionally. By 38, Malcolm worked as senior project manager at Bellamy, Rhodes & Vail, one of Atlanta's most respected architecture firms. From the outside, his life looked impressive. Midtown condo, tailored suits, client dinners, business trips, conference badges, hanging from leather briefcases. He moved through professional spaces with the ease of somebody who understood invisible rules instinctively, at least outwardly. But adaptation is exhausting when it never fully turns off. Most mornings Malcolm stood inside his condo bathroom adjusting ties while listening to NPR quietly in the background, already preparing versions of himself before leaving home. Different laugh for executives, different voice for clients, different body language depending on who entered conference rooms. One Tuesday afternoon during a redevelopment presentation, Malcolm watched a junior associate named Ethan interrupt a black female designer 3 separate times during a meeting. Nobody addressed it. Nobody even seemed to notice, except Malcolm absolutely noticed, because he spent years noticing things like that. The designer eventually stopped contributing altogether. After the meeting ended, Ethan slapped Malcolm lightly on the shoulder. "Good save in there, man." Malcolm smiled automatically. No problem. But driving home later through Atlanta traffic, he kept thinking about the designer's face after the 3rd interruption. That familiar emotional shutdown. Recognition. He understood it because he lived near that feeling himself. At a red light near Midtown, Malcolm caught his own reflection faintly in the windshield. Tired eyes, carefully maintained beard, expensive watch, and underneath all of it, exhaustion he still hadn't learned how to name yet. His phone buzzed through the car speakers. "Nadine, you alive or still pretending to enjoy networking events?" she asked immediately. Malcolm laughed softly. People really underestimate how draining architects are. "No," Nadine replied. "You just spend too much time around rich people who describe bourbon like it's scripture." He smiled, despite himself. "What you doing?" "Heading to this fundraiser thing on the south side." "You should come." "Absolutely not. See this why your life's stressful now?" "My life is not stressful." Nadine went quiet for half a second. "Malcolm." That tone made him sigh immediately. "What?" "You know you sound like somebody trying very hard not to feel anything." He rolled his eyes at the red light. "Here you go." "I'm serious." Traffic started moving again. Malcolm loosened one hand from the steering wheel. "Nadine, I worked 12 hours today. I'm not going to some community event with dry chicken and folding chairs." She burst out laughing. "Exactly why you need to go." He almost declined again. Honestly, he planned to. But later that night, after another reheated dinner eaten alone beside laptop emails and muted television noise, Malcolm found himself thinking about something uncomfortable. His entire life looked successful. So why did it constantly feel like maintenance instead of peace? That question stayed with him longer than expected, and without realizing it yet, that question was already leading him towards Zarya. Malcolm almost turned the car around twice on the drive there. The fundraiser took place inside an old recreation center on Atlanta's south side that still smelled faintly like floor polish and old basketballs. The parking lot had more pickup trucks than luxury cars, which Malcolm noticed immediately. Nadine texted him 3 times before he walked in. "Stop acting weird. If you leave, I'm telling your mother. And yes, there's dry chicken." Malcolm smiled despite himself and slipped his phone back into his pocket. Inside, folding chairs surrounded round plastic tables covered with dark green tablecloths that refused to stay flat at the corners. A local jazz trio played near the stage, while volunteers carried trays of baked macaroni and paper cups of sweet tea between tables. Nothing about the room looked polished. That was probably why Malcolm felt underdressed, despite wearing a blazer. A woman near the entrance handed him a name tag. "First time here? Is it obvious?" She laughed softly. "You still got the expression." "What expression?" "The one people make when they don't know where to stand yet." Malcolm glanced around awkwardly. Fair enough. Near the far wall, teenage volunteers sorted donated winter coats into different piles, while arguing over music choices coming from a portable speaker. That was where he saw her first. Zarya stood beside a folding table, helping a younger girl organize children's gloves by size. She wore dark jeans, white sneakers, and a mustard-colored sweater with one sleeve pushed halfway to her elbow. Her curls looked loosely pinned together, like she fixed them quickly before leaving home. Nothing dramatic about her. No cinematic entrance. No moment where the room suddenly disappeared. What Malcolm noticed first wasn't beauty. It was attention. She listened to people completely. A nervous teenage girl beside her kept rambling about wanting to become a nurse someday, speaking too fast, the way insecure people sometimes do when they're afraid somebody will interrupt them. Most adults would have nodded politely and moved on. Zarya didn't. What kind? She asked. The girl blinked. What? What kind of nurse? Zarya repeated while folding jackets. You want to work with babies? Trauma patients? Pediatrics? The teenager hesitated. I don't know. Maybe babies. Zarya nodded seriously like the answer mattered. NICU nurses are strong. That work emotional. The girl smiled differently after that. Straighter somehow. Malcolm found himself watching longer than intended. Nadine appeared beside him, holding 2 paper plates. Oh no, she said immediately. Malcolm looked away from Zarya too fast. What? You got the face. I don't have a face. You absolutely do. Nadine grinned. That quiet little corporate face you make when somebody disrupts your emotional schedule. Malcolm rolled his eyes. Relax. Who is she? I don't know. Nadine followed his line of sight toward Zarya. Then she laughed softly. Oh, this gonna be good. Nothing is happening. Sure. Before Malcolm could answer, Nadine was already walking across the room toward the coat tables. He muttered under his breath immediately. Unbelievable. A few seconds later, Zarya looked up while Nadine spoke to her. Then both women glanced toward Malcolm at the same time. Too late to escape now. Nadine waved him over dramatically. Malcolm walked across the room trying not to look irritated. Nadine enjoys embarrassing people recreationally, he said as he approached. Correct, Nadine replied proudly. Malcolm, this is Zarya. Zarya, this is my cousin who thinks community events lower his credit score. Zarya laughed immediately. Not loudly, warmly. That true? She asked. Malcolm shook his head. I said no such thing. You implied it spiritually, Nadine said. Zarya smiled and extended her hand. Nice meeting you. Her grip surprised him. Confident, grounded, not performative. You too. Nadine's phone buzzed. Then, hold this, she muttered, shoving her plate into Malcolm's hands before stepping away toward the hallway. Traitor. For a second, Malcolm and Zarya stood there awkwardly between piles of donated coats and paper snowflake decorations taped badly to the wall. So, Zarya said, folding another jacket carefully. You hate these events? I don't hate them. You definitely walked in like somebody arriving for jury duty. Malcolm laughed before he could stop himself. That obvious? A little. He leaned lightly against the table. My cousin exaggerated. I've just had a long week. What you do? Architecture project management. Zarya nodded slowly. That sounds exhausting in a spreadsheet kind of way. That's painfully accurate. What about you? He asked. I'm a trauma counselor. Malcolm blinked slightly. For adults? Mostly teenage girls. That's heavy. Sometimes. She shrugged gently. You learn people survive more than you expect. There was something about the way she spoke that immediately relaxed him. No performance, no networking energy, no subtle social competition. Most professional conversations Malcolm had these days felt layered with invisible evaluation. Status, education, income, connections. Talking to Zarya felt strangely absent of all that. She glanced at his untouched plate. You gonna eat that macaroni or continue judging it silently? I'm assessing texture. That's exactly what somebody with expensive throw pillows would say. He laughed again. A real laugh this time. Not the measured professional version. The conversation should have ended there honestly. Instead, it stretched naturally. They talked while volunteers folded clothes around them, about Atlanta traffic, about terrible apartment maintenance stories, about how nobody actually enjoys networking mixers despite pretending otherwise. At one point, Zarya described one of her teenage clients getting suspended for punching a locker after another student mocked her thrift store shoes. Everybody called her aggressive, Zarya said quietly. Nobody asked why humiliation sat that close to the surface already. Malcolm looked at her carefully. You think people do that often? What? Judge reactions without asking what built them. Zarya gave him a look that somehow felt both amused and serious. All the time. Something about the answer lingered inside him, By the end of the fundraiser, Malcolm had helped stack chairs despite initially planning to leave early. Nadine noticed immediately. "You helping voluntarily?" she whispered dramatically. "Who are you? Relax." Outside, Atlanta air felt cool for once. Rain from earlier still darkened parts of the parking lot, while distant music drifted from a passing car. Malcolm unlocked his sedan and glanced toward the recreation center entrance one last time before leaving. Zarya stood near the doorway laughing at something an elderly volunteer said, while balancing leftover pound cake containers in both hands. She looked comfortable there, not trying to impress anybody, just present. That image followed him home unexpectedly. 3 days later, he texted Nadine pretending not to care. "You got Zarya's number?" Nadine responded instantly. "Look at God." Malcolm stared at the message for a full 10 seconds before replying, "You're annoying. Very." Then her next message came through. "Don't waste her time if you still trying to date like a LinkedIn profile." He almost ignored that part. Instead, he sat there, rereading it, longer than necessary. Their first actual date happened at a food truck park near Old Fourth Ward because Zarya refused his original dinner suggestion immediately. "Absolutely not," she said over the phone. "What's wrong with Sibo-e Bev?" "Nothing." "If your goal is spending $30 on decorative foam," Malcolm laughed softly. "So where do you want to go?" "Somewhere people use napkins from dispensers." That became their rhythm quickly. Easy. Unforced. Zarya hated performative dating rituals. She thought expensive restaurants were too loud, and valet parking was unnecessary unless somebody physically couldn't walk far. Meanwhile, Malcolm had spent years dating women who treated polished experiences like relationship proof. Zarya cared more about conversation. The first night they ate tacos, sitting on folding metal chairs under string lights, while somebody nearby played bad acoustic guitar covers. At one point, Malcolm caught himself watching her instead of listening. Not because she was trying to impress him, because she wasn't. That felt rare. "What?" she asked suddenly. You got quiet." "Just thinking." "Dangerous hobby." He smiled faintly. "You always this suspicious?" "Only around men who iron t-shirts." "Ironed shirts matter." "To who?" He opened his mouth, then paused. Zarya grinned immediately. "Exactly." The relationship developed slowly after that. Not through dramatic declarations. Through repetition. Late-night drives through neighborhoods filled with old brick houses and uneven sidewalks. Phone calls that lasted longer than intended. Her showing up at his condo exhausted after work, wearing hospital socks under sweatpants because she forgot to change before leaving the counseling center. Those nights, Malcolm learned what emotional honesty actually sounded like. Not polished vulnerability, real exhaustion. "One of my girls apologized 3 times before asking for water today," Zarya said one evening while stealing fries from his takeout container. They sat on the couch with a documentary playing unwatched in the background. Why? She grew up around adults who made basic needs feel inconvenient. Malcolm looked over at her quietly. Zarya leaned back against the couch cushions. "You can tell a lot about people by what they apologize for automatically." The statement sat with him. Not because it sounded profound, because it sounded observed. That was the difference with her. She didn't speak like somebody trying to sound wise. She paid attention. One Sunday morning, Malcolm found Zarya standing barefoot in his kitchen, arguing with his coffee machine. "You okay over there? This thing hates me personally. You gotta press brew twice. Why would anybody design it like that? Character building. Your appliance got trauma." He laughed while walking over to help her, then stopped unexpectedly when she reached absent-mindedly for the sleeve of his sweatshirt while waiting for coffee. Tiny gesture, thoughtless, comfortable. Something about it affected him more than dramatic affection would have. That was new for him too. Most of Malcolm's previous relationships operated through presentation, couple photos, fancy reservations, social approval. With Zarya, intimacy lived inside ordinary things. Shared silence, inside jokes, her falling asleep with one foot touching his leg because she hated sleeping without physical contact. The more time Malcolm spent around her, the less monitored he felt. That realization unsettled him slightly at first. One Friday evening, After she fell asleep on his couch mid-conversation, Malcolm muted the television and sat there watching her quietly. Rain tapped softly against the balcony windows. Her glasses sat crooked beside an unfinished mug of tea. The room looked lived in for once. Not staged, not carefully arranged, just human. And for the first time in years, Malcolm noticed something strange. He felt relaxed inside his own life. Not impressive, not successful, not strategically composed, just relaxed. That scared him a little, because it meant Zarya was reaching parts of him he normally kept protected without even trying. By the second year of their relationship, Malcolm and Zarya had developed routines that looked solid from the outside. Sunday grocery trips, shared streaming passwords, her leaving bobby pins all over his bathroom counter, despite promising repeatedly she would stop. His habit of checking weather forecasts before she drove long distances because her Honda made a strange clicking sound during heavy rain. Ordinary couple things. That was what made the cracks harder to identify at first. Nothing looked broken dramatically. Most of the tension arrived quietly through rooms Malcolm thought he understood better than she did. Especially work events. The invitation for the Bellamy, Rhodes, and Vale executive dinner arrived on a Thursday afternoon through Malcolm's office email. Private dining room, Midtown Steakhouse, senior partners attending, city redevelopment investors present, the kind of night Malcolm usually prepared for carefully. When he mentioned it over dinner, Zarya looked up from her takeout container. "You want me to come?" "Only if you want to." That sounded dangerous. He smiled faintly. "You know what I mean." She studied him for a second. "You worried I'm going to embarrass you?" Malcolm immediately shook his head. "No." Too quickly. Zarya noticed. She always noticed. "I was joking," she said lightly, though something in her expression shifted slightly afterward. The night of the dinner, Malcolm spent nearly 20 minutes deciding between ties, while Zarya sat cross-legged on the bed, scrolling through emails on her laptop. "You know all rich people ties look exactly the same to me," she muttered without looking up. "These are completely different ties. They both say, 'I know what a wine pairing is.'" He laughed despite himself. Zarya eventually closed the laptop and stood beside the closet adjusting her earrings. She wore a fitted black dress with gold hoops and low heels she already complained about twice before leaving home. "You nervous?" she asked suddenly. "About what?" "Your work people." Malcolm shrugged. "Not nervous, just, these events matter." Zarya nodded slowly. That answer stayed hanging between them during the drive. The restaurant sat high above Midtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Atlanta lights stretching across the city. Everything inside looked expensive in a quiet way. Soft music, dark wood, waiters speaking almost silently. Malcolm relaxed visibly the moment they entered. Zarya noticed immediately. His posture straightened. His smile changed slightly. Even his voice shifted. Not fake, exactly. More polished. At the hostess stand, Malcolm shook hands with coworkers differently than he shook hands around family. Firmer, measured, controlled. "Malcolm." Brent Vale called from near the bar. "Good to see you." Brent greeted Zarya politely, though Malcolm noticed the quick evaluative glance common at these events. People there categorized each other instantly. Education, money, class familiarity, social usefulness. Zarya noticed too. She simply didn't care. That difference would become important later. Dinner started smoothly enough. Wine glasses, investment conversations, people discussing Atlanta redevelopment projects like they were talking about weather patterns instead of neighborhoods full of actual families. Zarya remained mostly quiet at first, listening while cutting pieces of salmon slowly. Malcolm appreciated that more than he should have. Halfway through dinner, one of the senior partners, Ellison, started discussing a new redevelopment corridor near southwest Atlanta. "You know how those areas get," Ellison said casually while sipping bourbon. "You clean things up, bring business in, and suddenly everybody acts offended by progress." A few people around the table laughed softly. Malcolm gave the automatic professional smile he'd perfected years earlier. Then he noticed Zarya stop eating, not dramatically, just stillness. "What does clean things up mean exactly?" she asked calmly. The table shifted slightly. Tiny reactions. Somebody adjusted silverware. Another man reached for his drink. Ellison smiled, the way wealthy men often smile when they assume charm can smooth over implications. "You know," he said, "lower crime. New investment. Better property value." Zarya nodded once. Interesting how safety suddenly becomes urgent once wealthier residents move in. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Not long, but long enough. Malcolm felt heat rise into his neck immediately. The silence felt dangerous to him in ways he couldn't fully explain logically. Because he understood these rooms. Understood how quickly people labeled someone difficult, combative, political, and before he fully processed it, Malcolm laughed lightly and said, "Zarya likes making people uncomfortable." Relief spread across the table instantly. A couple people laughed. Ellison chuckled harder than necessary. Conversation resumed, but Zarya didn't laugh. She looked at Malcolm briefly. Just one glance, no anger in it. That was what unsettled him later. Recognition, like she had learned something important quietly. The rest of dinner continued normally on the surface. Dessert menus, investment jokes, business talk. But Malcolm felt tension sitting beside him now. Not explosive tension, distance. And once he noticed it, he couldn't stop noticing it. During valet pickup, Zarya stood silently beside him, scrolling through her phone, while cold night air moved through the parking area. "You okay?" he finally asked. "I'm fine." Same answer his mother used to give. That should have warned him. Inside the car, Atlanta traffic crawled slowly beneath glowing streetlights, while jazz played quietly through the speakers. Malcolm kept both hands on the wheel. "You embarrassed me tonight." The sentence came out sharper than intended. Zarya stared out the passenger window for a moment before answering. "No," she said calmly. "I interrupted a comfortable conversation. That's not the same thing." "It kind of is." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "You know how these environments work. That sentence bothers me every time you say it." "What's that supposed to mean?" She turned toward him finally. "It means you keep acting like honesty becomes inappropriate once wealthy people enter the room. That's not fair, isn't it?" The light turned green. Malcolm drove forward harder than necessary. "You always turn things into social commentary. And you always pretend social commentary stops existing because people ordered expensive wine." He tightened his jaw. "That's not what I'm doing." Zarya watched him quietly, then softer. "You laughed with them." Malcolm stared ahead at traffic. "What was I supposed to do? Turn dinner into an argument?" "No." Her voice stayed calm, which somehow frustrated him more. "You could have just not turned me into the joke that fixed everybody's discomfort." That landed harder than he expected, because part of him knew exactly what she meant. But shame often reaches for defensiveness first. "You're overanalyzing this." "I really don't think I am." He rubbed one hand against the steering wheel. "You don't understand how corporate spaces work, and I think you understand them too well." Silence filled the car after that. Outside, rain from earlier reflected across Atlanta streets in blurred gold streaks. Malcolm suddenly felt exhausted. Not from the argument, from the deeper truth sitting underneath it. Because if he was honest, Zarya wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. At home, she kicked off her heels near the couch and headed toward the kitchen without another word. Malcolm loosened his tie slowly. "You seriously gonna stay mad over one dinner?" Zarya opened the refrigerator and grabbed water. "I'm not mad." "You clearly are." "No." She twisted the cap carefully. "I'm paying attention." That answer bothered him immediately. "What does that mean?" She leaned lightly against the counter. "It means, I notice how different you become in rooms where approval matters to you." Malcolm laughed once without humor. "So now I'm fake?" "I didn't say fake." "Then what are you saying?" Zarya hesitated briefly, and that hesitation mattered, because she usually chose her words carefully once emotions entered conversations. "I think," she said slowly, "you spent so much time learning how to survive certain spaces that now you confuse emotional silence with maturity." The apartment became very quiet. Traffic hummed faintly outside somewhere below the condo windows. Malcolm looked away first, because deep down, something inside him recognized the truth immediately. And recognition can feel a lot like insult when somebody reaches a part of you that still feels unfinished. Neither of them raised their voices that night. That was the problem. The conversation simply settled between them, heavy, unresolved. And over the following months, Malcolm started noticing a pattern neither of them fully named yet. In private, he often agreed with Zarya, completely. But in public, he softened things, redirected things, managed tension, especially when powerful people sat nearby. At first, those moments seemed small enough to dismiss. A subject change here, a nervous laugh there, a quick interruption disguised as diplomacy, tiny betrayals, the kind people barely notice while they're happening, the kind that slowly teach someone whether they're emotionally safe beside you in public. The first time Zarya noticed Malcolm changing his voice around different people, she didn't mention it immediately, not because she missed it, because she was deciding whether it meant something deeper or whether everybody adjusted themselves a little depending on the room. At first, she gave it grace. People survived environments differently. She understood that better than most. Working with traumatized teenagers taught her quickly that survival habits didn't disappear just because somebody became successful later. Still, over time, certain patterns became difficult to ignore, especially once she started moving more regularly through Malcolm's world. One Saturday afternoon they drove to East Point for a cookout hosted by Zarya's cousin, Renelle. The neighborhood looked lived in, kids riding bikes too close to parked cars, music leaking from open garages, plastic chairs scattered across front yards, men arguing loudly over basketball near folding tables covered with soda bottles and dominoes, the kind of gathering Malcolm actually grew up around. Yet every time they attended one, something inside him tightened slightly. Not visibly enough for most people to notice, but Zarya noticed, always. As soon as they stepped through the backyard gate, Renelle pointed toward Malcolm dramatically. There go corporate black. Malcolm laughed automatically. You say that every time. Because every time you walk in here looking like you finna approve somebody mortgage application, everybody nearby laughed. Malcolm laughed too, but Zarya noticed the small stiffness in his shoulders immediately afterward, not anger. Adjustment, that familiar recalibration he slipped into around different groups. You want a drink? She asked quietly. Yeah. While Renelle argued with somebody near the grill, Zarya followed Malcolm inside the house toward the kitchen cooler. You okay? She asked. I'm fine. You get tense at these cookouts. I do not. You do a little. Malcolm grabbed a bottled water. I just haven't seen some of these people in a while. That's not what I mean. He closed the cooler harder than necessary. Zarya, can we not psychoanalyze me at family functions? She held his gaze for a second, then nodded once. All right. But later that evening, she kept noticing things. The way Malcolm's laugh deepened around certain men. How he suddenly used neighborhood slang more heavily with old friends than he ever did naturally at home. The way he became overly polished again, anytime conversations shifted toward education or money. It wasn't dishonesty exactly. That was what made it complicated. Every version of Malcolm was technically real, but none of them seemed fully relaxed. At one point during dinner, one of Renelle's friends asked Malcolm about architecture work downtown. You probably making crazy money now, the man joked. Malcolm shrugged lightly. It pays all right. Renelle snorted immediately. Man, please. Malcolm buy groceries that got words nobody can pronounce. Everybody laughed. Zarya smiled too, but she noticed Malcolm quickly downplay everything afterward. Not humble exactly. Careful, like he constantly monitored how much of himself was acceptable in each direction. Too polished around family looked arrogant. Too relaxed around corporate people looked threatening. Watching him navigate those invisible lines started making Zarya sad in ways she couldn't fully explain yet. On the drive home that night, Atlanta traffic moved slowly beneath orange streetlights while old R&B played softly through the speakers. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Zarya looked over at him. You know what your problem is? Malcolm groaned immediately. That sentence never leads anywhere good. I'm serious. So am I. She rested her elbow lightly against the window. You think acceptance and respect are the same thing. Malcolm frowned. What's that supposed to mean? You spend so much energy making sure everybody comfortable with you. That's called adulthood. No. She shook her head gently. That's called management. He laughed once without humor. Here we go. You act different, depending on who's around, Because you think belonging is something you earn constantly. That's not true. Zarya turned slightly toward him. You don't even realize you're doing it anymore. The comment irritated him immediately, because part of him recognized it. And Malcolm hated conversations where somebody reached a truth before he was emotionally ready to admit it himself. You always making everything deeper than it is. Because everything is deeper than you pretend it is. The car became quiet again. Malcolm stared ahead at traffic. A few minutes later, he changed the subject entirely. Classic Malcolm. You hungry again? Zarya almost smiled. Almost. That became another pattern too. Whenever conversations moved too close to emotional exposure, Malcolm redirected gently. Food, work, television, practical tasks, never aggressively. Just enough to avoid staying vulnerable too long. Months passed. The relationship still looked healthy from the outside. They laughed constantly. Still danced in the kitchen sometimes, while leftovers warmed in the microwave. Still took late-night drives through Atlanta neighborhoods, arguing about terrible apartment architecture and rising rent prices. But underneath all of it, Zarya kept collecting moments quietly. At another work function, Malcolm interrupted her mid-sentence after she criticized a redevelopment tax proposal. Okay, but it's more complicated than that, he said too quickly. She noticed the senior partners watching. Later in the elevator, he immediately softened. I just didn't want it turning into a whole debate. You always say that. Because you always make things intense. Zarya leaned against the elevator wall. No, I make people uncomfortable sometimes. That's basically the same thing. She stared at him for a second after he said it. Not angry. Thinking. That expression started unsettling Malcolm more lately. Because instead of arguing harder, she had begun observing him more carefully. Like she was slowly understanding something she wished wasn't true. One rainy Sunday afternoon, they visited Corinne for dinner. The apartment smelled like fried catfish and lemon cleaner, same way it had since Malcolm was a teenager. Corinne adored Zarya openly. That somehow made Malcolm nervous too. At one point while setting plates on the table, Corinne looked at Malcolm and shook her head. You know she better than you, right? Wow, Malcolm muttered. Good evening to you too. Zarya laughed loudly. Corinne pointed toward her. She say what she mean. That's rare. Something passed across Malcolm's face too quickly for Corinne to identify, but Zarya caught it immediately. Discomfort. Again, even praise directed toward her occasionally unsettled him if it highlighted qualities he struggled with himself. Later that night after dinner, Malcolm stood beside the sink rinsing plates while Zarya dried them quietly. Corinne hummed gospel music from the living room while folding laundry. You got quiet, Zarya said softly. I'm washing dishes. That's not what I meant. Malcolm sighed lightly. Can we have one normal day without dissecting my personality? Zarya placed another plate carefully into the cabinet. You know what's interesting? What? You always think honesty is criticism. He looked over at her. That's because you analyze everything. No. She shook her head gently. I pay attention. There it was again. That word. Attention. Zarya noticed emotional details Malcolm spent most of his life trying to smooth over before others could see them, and part of him loved her deeply for that. Another part felt exposed around her in ways he still didn't know how to tolerate comfortably. That contradiction started exhausting both of them. One evening several weeks later, Malcolm arrived home after a long client meeting to find Zarya sitting cross-legged on the couch grading workshop notes from one of her youth counseling programs. The condo smelled like garlic and onions from dinner she'd started earlier. You eat yet? She asked without looking up. Not hungry. That meeting bad? He loosened his tie slowly. Just annoying. Zarya studied him briefly. You okay? Yeah, but he wasn't. Not exactly. During the meeting earlier that afternoon, one executive had referred to displaced residents as transition obstacles while discussing redevelopment timelines. Malcolm hated the phrase immediately. Still, he said nothing. And afterward, while driving home, he kept imagining how Zarya would have reacted hearing it. Probably calmly, probably directly, probably without fear. That realization irritated him because it exposed something he didn't want to examine closely. By the time he sat beside her on the couch, tension still clung to him. Zarya closed the folder slowly. You want to talk about it? Malcolm hesitated, then surprised himself by answering honestly. Sometimes I feel tired before conversations even happen. Zarya stayed quiet, letting him continue. I walk into certain rooms, already preparing myself. For what? He stared toward the television screen reflecting faintly across the dark room. To not become the version of myself people punish. The honesty sat heavily between them. Zarya's expression softened immediately. That was the problem. Whenever Malcolm finally exposed something real, she handled it gently instead of dismissing it, which made it harder to hide afterward. She reached for his hand. Malcolm. But here's the messed up part, he interrupted quietly. I don't even know who I am naturally anymore sometimes. That sentence scared him after he said it out loud. Because he meant it. Zarya squeezed his hand lightly. Then after a long silence, she asked the question that quietly changed how Malcolm understood their relationship from that point forward. Do you know how exhausting it is, loving somebody who keeps disappearing depending on the room? He looked at her immediately. Not defensive this time, just hurt. Because deep down, he finally understood what she meant. And worse, he realized she wasn't asking the question to accuse him anymore. She was asking because she sounded tired. The night everything finally shifted between Malcolm and Zarya started quietly enough to be forgettable. That was the dangerous thing about life-changing conversations. They rarely announce themselves properly. Rain tapped softly against the condo windows, while Malcolm reheated leftover pasta in the microwave after another late meeting downtown. His tie hung loose around his neck, and the sleeves of his dress shirt stayed rolled halfway up his forearms. The condo lights were dim, except for the kitchen. Zarya sat at the counter wearing one of Malcolm's old college t-shirts and gray sweatpants, flipping slowly through paperwork from one of her housing outreach workshops. Something about her felt distant that night. Not angry, withdrawn. Malcolm noticed immediately. You okay? Yeah. Short answer. Too short. The microwave beeped. Malcolm grabbed the plate carefully and leaned against the counter while steam rose from the pasta container. You sure? Zarya kept reading another page before finally setting the papers down. How long did you know? Malcolm frowned slightly. Know what? The displacement numbers. His stomach tightened instantly. There it was, the redevelopment project. Bellamy, Rhodes, and Vale had spent months working with city officials and private investors on a large, mixed-use redevelopment corridor near southwest Atlanta. Luxury retail, condos, commercial property expansion. Publicly, the project had been marketed as economic renewal. Privately, Malcolm knew several older apartment blocks would eventually be cleared. He also knew relocation assistance discussions were incomplete at best. Zarya watched him carefully now. Not emotional. That almost made it worse. What numbers? He asked too carefully. That wasn't an answer. Rain continued tapping lightly against the windows. Somewhere outside, a siren drifted faintly through midtown traffic. Malcolm set the plate down untouched. How did this even come up? One of my girls came into counseling crying today. Zarya's voice stayed level. Her grandmother got relocation notices. Malcolm rubbed his forehead slowly. It's more complicated than that. There you go again. What does that mean? You always start speaking like a press conference whenever something gets uncomfortable. The irritation hit him immediately. I'm trying to explain the situation. No. Zarya shook her head gently. You're trying to reduce the emotional reality of it. Malcolm exhaled harder now. Zarya, these projects involve legal agreements, timelines, zoning issues, and people. The sentence cut through him cleanly because she didn't raise her voice saying it. Just truth. Quiet truth. That family already struggling, she continued. The grandmother works nights at a nursing home. The girl barely stabilized after months of self-harm recovery. Now, they don't even know where they're gonna live in 3 months. Malcolm stared down at the counter. He hated this feeling. Because he agreed with her emotionally, but professionally, he had spent years learning how to separate emotional response from operational responsibility. That separation suddenly sounded uglier in front of her. You think I'm personally evicting people? He asked defensively. No. Zarya folded her arms lightly. I think you stopped noticing what participation looks like when it wears a suit and speaks professionally. The words landed hard. Hard enough that Malcolm felt shame rise almost instantly. And shame had always been dangerous territory for him, not because he couldn't feel it, because he learned young how to protect himself from sitting inside it too long, usually through defensiveness. You act like everything I worked for is morally corrupt. I never said that. You imply it constantly. Malcolm. No. He pushed away from the counter now, frustration finally surfacing. Every conversation turns into some ethical interrogation with you lately. That's not true. It is. Rain hit harder outside suddenly. The condo felt smaller now, more crowded emotionally. Zarya looked at him quietly for several seconds before speaking again. You know what I think? Malcolm laughed once without humor. This should be good. I think somewhere along the way, your fear of losing acceptance became stronger than your ability to be honest. The room went still, because deep down, Malcolm knew she had reached something real again. And he was exhausted by how often she could do that. You don't understand how these systems work, he snapped. No, Zarya replied calmly. I understand exactly how they work. That's why this bothers me. He dragged one hand across his face. You make me feel like I'm failing some moral test all the time. Her expression changed slightly then, not anger. Pain. Real pain. That's what you think this is? I don't know what this is anymore. Zarya leaned back against the counter slowly. That's honest, at least. Something about her calmness started making him feel cornered emotionally, like every defensive response sounded weaker the moment it left his mouth. And instead of slowing down, Malcolm pushed harder. Classic Malcolm. If you hate this life so much, why are you even here? The second the words left his mouth, the room changed. Subtly, but permanently. Zarya stared at him without speaking. Malcolm immediately felt the damage underneath the sentence, even though part of him still wanted to defend it. That's not what I meant, he muttered. Isn't it? I'm saying, no. Her voice stayed soft. Say exactly what you mean. That terrified him more than yelling would have, because Malcolm suddenly realized he didn't fully know what he meant anymore, only that he felt accused, exposed, emotionally trapped, and tired, so tired. I'm tired of feeling judged in my own home, he said finally. Another silence. Then, Zarya asked quietly, do you still recognize yourself inside the life you built? The question hit him harder than anything else that night, because nobody had ever asked him that directly before. Not Nadine, not Corinne, not even himself. Malcolm looked away toward the rain-covered windows. Atlanta lights blurred faintly against the glass. You think I sold out, he said quietly. I think you disappeared gradually. His chest tightened instantly. That's unfair. Is it? Zarya's voice trembled slightly now for the first time all night. Not from anger. Exhaustion. You apologize for me in rooms where I haven't done anything wrong. I do not. You laugh when people say things you privately disagree with. That's called professionalism. No, she said softly. Sometimes it's fear. The word sat there heavily. Fear. Malcolm hated how accurate it sounded. Hated it, because he understood immediately she wasn't talking about fear of losing jobs. She meant deeper fear. Social rejection, isolation, disapproval, becoming unacceptable. And Malcolm had spent most of his life arranging himself carefully to avoid exactly those things. I worked hard for this life, he said finally, quieter now. I know you did. You think that means nothing? I didn't say that. But every time we talk lately, you make it sound like everything I built came at the cost of my integrity. Zarya looked at him sadly then, and somehow sadness felt worse than anger, because anger still fights for something. Sadness starts grieving. You know what hurts? She asked softly. Malcolm stayed silent. I don't think you even notice when you abandon yourself anymore. The sentence sat between them like broken glass. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Rain kept falling steadily outside. Finally, Malcolm crossed his arms tightly and said the sentence he would replay in his head years later while standing alone in grocery stores and empty parking lots. If you can't accept the life I worked for, maybe you should think about whether you even want this marriage. Silence. Complete silence. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Zarya just stared at him. And for the first time since they met, Malcolm watched something inside her become still, That was the moment. Not the divorce papers later. Not moving boxes. Not court documents. This, right here. Because certain silences only arrive after somebody understands something painful beyond debate. Zarya lowered her eyes briefly, then nodded once. Not coldly, not theatrically, just tired. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded heartbreakingly calm. I think I've been mourning this marriage longer than you realize. Malcolm felt the room drop out beneath him emotionally, because deep down, he understood immediately she meant it. The first few days after the kitchen argument felt strangely normal. That was what confused Malcolm. Zarya still went to work, still watered the plant near the balcony doors every morning, still asked whether he wanted coffee before leaving the condo. Nothing exploded. Part of Malcolm took comfort in that. People said terrible things during relationships sometimes. Time usually softened rough conversations. At least that was what he told himself. So when Zarya became quieter afterward, Malcolm interpreted it the wrong way completely. He thought distance meant cooling off, not detachment. One Tuesday evening, he came home carrying takeout from their favorite Thai place near Midtown. The elevator ride up smelled faintly like somebody's cigarette smoke drifting through the hallway vents. Malcolm balanced the paper bag against his hip while checking emails on his phone. Normal evening, normal routine. He unlocked the condo door expecting television noise or music from the kitchen. Instead, the apartment sounded unusually still, not empty, controlled. Malcolm stepped inside slowly. That was when he noticed the boxes. 3 cardboard boxes stacked neatly beside the dining table. Not packed chaotically. Organized. Intentional. A smaller pile sat near the hallway wall with framed photos wrapped carefully in towels. Malcolm stopped moving. Zarya sat cross-legged on the floor near the couch, sorting books into separate piles. Keep, donate, pack. She looked up calmly when he entered. You hungry? He asked automatically. The question sounded ridiculous the moment it left his mouth. A little, she answered softly. Malcolm set the food down slowly on the kitchen counter. What's all this? Zarya rested both hands against the closed lid of a box. I signed a lease. The sentence landed strangely flat in the room. Malcolm stared at her for a second, waiting for clarification that didn't come. A lease for what? A duplex near Adair Park. Silence. Rain tapped lightly against the balcony windows again. Same soft rhythm from the night of their argument. Malcolm laughed once quietly, mostly out of disbelief. You serious? Zarya nodded. I think this is the healthiest decision right now. His chest tightened immediately. So you just decided to leave? No. Her voice stayed calm. I decided a while ago. I just finally acted on it. That hurt more than anger would have. Malcolm pulled out one of the dining chairs and sat heavily. You're acting like this marriage completely failed. Zarya looked at him sadly. Malcolm. No, seriously. He gestured vaguely toward the condo. We not cheating on each other. We not screaming every night. We still love each other. I know. Then how are we suddenly here? Zarya stayed quiet briefly before answering. Because love stopped feeling emotionally safe. That sentence frustrated him instantly. What does that even mean? She leaned back against the couch slowly. It means I got tired of becoming smaller every time honesty threatened your comfort. Malcolm rubbed his forehead hard. You keep making me sound manipulative. I don't think you manipulative. Then what? I think you scared. The word irritated him immediately again. Everybody suddenly thought they understood him. Zarya, Nadine, even Corinne sometimes. Malcolm stood up abruptly and walked toward the kitchen island. So what now? You move out and we just magically become strangers? That's not what I said. Then what are you saying? Zarya inhaled slowly. I'm saying I don't recognize myself inside this relationship anymore. The condo became very quiet after that. The takeout containers sat untouched between them, while steam slowly disappeared from the paper bag. Malcolm hated how calm she sounded, not because calmness was cruel, because it sounded prepared, like she'd already spent weeks grieving privately before he even realized they were standing near an ending. You already tell your family? He asked eventually. Yes. That answer stung too, not because she told them, because it confirmed how long she'd emotionally moved ahead of him already. When? A few days ago. Malcolm laughed softly without humor. Unbelievable. Zarya watched him carefully. You still think this happened because of one argument? It didn't? No. She shook her head gently. It happened through accumulation. There was that word again. Accumulation. Tiny moments. Tiny silences. Tiny humiliations. Malcolm understood the concept intellectually. Emotionally, he still rejected it. Because part of him believed damage should look dramatic, if it deserved this level of consequence. The actual move started 2 weekends later. And somehow that hurt even worse, because everybody behaved normally. Renelle arrived first, driving a pickup truck, while old-school R&B played loudly through blown speakers. You got boxes taped wrong, he announced immediately after walking inside. Zarya rolled her eyes. Good morning to you too. I'm serious. Bottom's weak. He grabbed fresh tape from his jacket pocket, like he carried emergency moving supplies professionally. Malcolm stood near the kitchen island, holding coffee he forgot to drink. Nothing about the morning felt real yet. Zarya moved through the condo, quietly folding clothes into containers and wrapping dishes carefully in newspaper. Not crying, not angry, focused. That focus unsettled Malcolm deeply. At one point, he watched her remove her conditioner bottles from the shower shelf. Such a tiny thing. Still, his chest tightened immediately. The condo already looked different, less alive. Renelle carried lamps downstairs while muttering complaints about Atlanta parking the entire time. You midtown people paying rent and fighting traffic voluntarily, he grumbled. Nobody laughed much. Around noon, Nadine arrived carrying extra boxes. She hugged Zarya first, longer than Malcolm expected. Then she hugged him too, though more carefully. You okay? She asked quietly. Yeah. The automatic lie came easily. Nadine looked unconvinced, but didn't push. That was another thing Malcolm noticed lately. People around him had started speaking softer, like they sensed something fragile he still refused to admit, fully himself. Later that afternoon, Malcolm found Zarya kneeling beside the bookshelf, removing framed photos. One picture showed them at Piedmont Park during their second year together. Both laughing, while sunlight hit Zarya's face sideways. Malcolm stared at it too long. You remember that day? He asked quietly. Zarya glanced at the photo. Yeah, we got caught in that random storm. You got mad because your shoes got ruined. They were expensive shoes. They were ugly shoes. For the first time all day, both of them smiled slightly. The moment disappeared quickly. Still, it hurt. Because it reminded Malcolm how natural they used to feel before every conversation started carrying hidden tension underneath it. By evening, the condo looked strangely hollow already. Bookshelves half empty. Bathroom counters cleared. Kitchen cabinets missing pieces of her. Evidence of departure everywhere. Renelle carried the last box toward the door, before pausing near Malcolm. You good? Yeah. Renelle studied him for a second, then sighed softly. Man, sometimes people leave because staying started costing too much emotionally. Malcolm immediately stiffened. You think I treated her badly? That ain't what I said. Everybody acting like I'm some terrible husband suddenly. Renelle shook his head slowly. Nah, that's the problem actually. Malcolm frowned. What? You think damage only counts when somebody horrible involved. The words sat heavily between them. Because Malcolm genuinely had loved Zarya. He remembered her coffee orders, rubbed her shoulders during migraines, checked her tire pressure before long drives, warmed towels in the dryer for her during winter mornings. In his mind, those things mattered. So how could the marriage still collapse? That question kept circling him while the final boxes disappeared downstairs. At the doorway, Zarya paused one last time inside the condo, not dramatically, just looking around quietly. Years lived here together. Meals, arguments, laughter, ordinary intimacy. Malcolm suddenly felt panic rise unexpectedly. Real panic. Not about divorce papers or logistics. Loss. You really doing this? He asked softly. Zarya looked at him for a long moment, then finally answered with heartbreaking honesty. I think I already did it emotionally a long time ago. The first month alone felt manageable. That was the lie Malcolm kept telling himself anyway. He still woke up at 6:30. Still ironed shirts on Sunday evenings. Still answered work emails before getting out of bed most mornings. From the outside, His life barely changed. That was the problem with certain kinds of heartbreak. Functionality hides damage. Well, the condo stayed clean, because Malcolm cleaned constantly now. Kitchen counters spotless. Throw blankets folded sharply. No dishes left overnight in the sink. At first, he told himself, he simply liked order. Eventually, he realized silence felt easier to control when everything else stayed organized. The condo sounded different without Zarya. That became obvious quickly. No music drifting from the bathroom while she got ready for work. No late-night humming from the kitchen. No random commentary from the couch during documentaries she claimed she wasn't watching. Just air conditioning humming softly through expensive rooms that suddenly felt too careful. One Wednesday evening, Malcolm came home after work and automatically unlocked his phone to text her about traffic near North Avenue, before remembering she no longer lived there. His thumb hovered over the screen awkwardly. Then he locked the phone again and stood inside the kitchen staring at nothing for almost a full minute. Little moments like that kept happening. He still bought the wrong yogurt accidentally because he reached for the brand she liked without thinking. Still shifted toward her side of the bed during sleep sometimes before waking up alone. Still expected to hear her keys near the front door around 6 in the evening. Absence turned ordinary routines into emotional traps. One night, Malcolm tried eating dinner at the dining table instead of the couch, like Zarya used to insist occasionally. Halfway through reheated salmon and rice, he realized the silence felt unbearable. He moved back to the couch immediately and turned the television volume too high. After that, the TV stayed on most nights, not because he cared what played. Noise just felt better than awareness. Around the third week alone, Corinne started calling more often, not directly checking on him. Subtle mother checking. You eating properly? You sleeping? You still going outside besides work? Questions disguised as casual conversation. One Sunday, she invited him over for dinner. Smothered turkey wings, candied yams, green beans cooked soft enough to collapse. The apartment smelled exactly the same as Malcolm remembered from childhood. Bleach, fried food, fabric softener, comforting smells. Corinne moved slower lately, Malcolm noticed, not dramatically. Just age settling into her joints more visibly. During dinner, she watched him carefully while he pushed food around his plate. You lose weight? I'm fine. Corinne never believed I'm fine. Not from anybody. Especially not Malcolm. After several quiet minutes, she finally asked, You hear from Zarya? Malcolm shrugged without looking up. Sometimes. She doing all right? I guess. Corinne folded her napkin slowly. That girl loved you hard. The statement irritated him immediately because it sounded like accusation wrapped inside observation. I loved her too. I know, but everybody acting like I ruined the marriage by myself. Corinne stayed quiet briefly, then softer. Pain ain't always about villains, baby. Malcolm leaned back heavily in the chair. So what? I'm just emotionally defective now? His mother sighed. You always do that. Do what? Turn criticism into catastrophe. He rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. I'm serious, Ma. So am I. Corinne looked at him steadily now. You know what your problem is? Malcolm laughed dryly. Apparently everybody does lately. You learned how to survive rooms before you learned how to rest inside yourself. The sentence landed harder than he expected, because it sounded exactly like something Zarya would say. That annoyed him too. Corinne noticed immediately. She told you similar things before she left, didn't she? Malcolm stayed silent. His mother nodded slowly, like silence confirmed enough. Outside, church traffic moved slowly through the apartment complex, while distant gospel music drifted faintly from somebody's car stereo. You spent your whole life trying not to make people uncomfortable, Corinne continued quietly. Eventually, that kind of habits start costing intimacy. Malcolm stared at the table. I was trying to build a stable life. I know, and somehow, that still wasn't enough. Corinne's face softened then. That girl didn't leave because you lacked ambition. Then why? His mother hesitated. Because older people sometimes know truths they hate speaking aloud. I think she got tired of competing with everybody you needed approval from. The apartment became very still after that. Malcolm left dinner earlier than usual. Not angrily, just emotionally full. Driving back through Atlanta traffic, he kept replaying the sentence in his head, competing with everybody you needed approval from. That sounded unfair and painfully accurate. At work, Malcolm buried himself deeper into projects afterward. Longer hours, more meetings, more networking dinners. But something had changed there too. The office suddenly felt colder in ways he hadn't noticed before. Conversations sounded transactional now, even laughter. One afternoon during a redevelopment strategy meeting, Malcolm watched executives debate relocation costs using phrases like community adjustment friction and resident transition barriers. Nobody said families. Nobody said children. Nobody said people. He found himself hearing Zarya's voice constantly now during meetings, not literally. Memory, what do you mean by clean things up? The thought unsettled him enough that he barely contributed the rest of the afternoon. Later that week, Malcolm stopped by a barber shop in Decatur he used to visit years ago, before Midtown convenience replaced familiarity. The shop smelled like aftershave, hair grease, and old leather chairs. Basketball highlights played loudly on mounted televisions while men argued about Falcons football near the front counter. For the first time in weeks, Malcolm felt something close to normal sitting there, until the barber casually asked, "You still with that counselor woman?" Malcolm looked up slightly. "Zarya? Yeah. She helped my niece get therapy after that panic attack last year." Malcolm blinked. "Oh, good woman." The barber kept cutting quietly for a moment before continuing. "My sisters still talk about her," said Zarya, the first person that made her daughter feel normal again. Malcolm stared at his reflection silently. That happened more often lately. Zarya's name appearing unexpectedly all over the city, at church, coffee shops, community events, barber shops. Everywhere she went, people remembered how she made them feel. Meanwhile, Malcolm started realizing most people in his professional world remembered him for usefulness, efficiency, connections, competence, not emotional impact. That realization followed him home heavily. One Friday evening, he stood inside the condo kitchen holding 2 coffee mugs, before remembering only one person lived there now. The realization irritated him enough that he shoved the second mug back into the cabinet harder than necessary, then immediately felt ridiculous afterward. He leaned both hands against the counter and laughed quietly at himself. This is pathetic. But grief often looks pathetic in private. That's why most people hide it badly behind routine. Later that night, Nadine called while Malcolm sat alone watching muted television. "You alive?" "Barely." "That dramatic energy exactly why I called." He smiled faintly. "What's up? You coming to the cookout next weekend?" "I don't know." Translation: "Yes." "Nadine, Malcolm." Her voice softened unexpectedly. "You can't isolate yourself every time life humbles you." He stared toward the dark balcony windows. "I'm not isolating." "You sleeping with the TV on yet?" Malcolm frowned immediately. "Oh, you know that." "Because divorced men always think noise counts as healing." He laughed, despite himself. Then silence settled briefly between them. Finally, Nadine asked carefully, "You miss her?" Malcolm looked around the condo slowly. The untouched throw pillows, the spotless kitchen, the unbearable neatness. Every room suddenly felt like evidence. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. Nadine exhaled softly on the other end. "You know the crazy part?" "What?" "I don't even think you missed the big moments most." Malcolm swallowed hard. Because she was right already. He missed ordinary things. Zarya stealing fries off his plate, her lotion bottles crowding the bathroom sink, the sound of her laughing at terrible reality television. Small things. Things nobody warns you become emotionally devastating later. After the call ended, Malcolm turned the television volume lower for the first time in weeks. The silence returned immediately, heavy, clean, honest. And sitting there alone inside the beautiful condo he worked years to afford, Malcolm finally understood something uncomfortable. He had built an impressive life, but he had no idea how to live inside it alone. The first rumors started quietly. That was usually how corporate scandals moved at Bellamy, Rhodes, and Vol. Not through dramatic announcements, through careful whispers in hallways, sudden closed-door meetings, executives lowering their voices, when assistants walked by. At first, Malcolm ignored it. Development projects attracted controversy constantly in Atlanta. Community pushback, zoning disputes, ethics complaints. None of that felt unusual anymore. Then one Tuesday morning, Brent Vale walked past Malcolm's office without his usual greeting. That caught Malcolm's attention immediately. By lunchtime, 2 meetings had been canceled without explanation. By evening, everybody sounded tense. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at work to find legal consultants sitting inside conference rooms usually reserved for investor presentations. Nobody explained anything directly, which meant something serious was happening. Around noon, Malcolm finally cornered Ethan near the coffee station. "What's going on?" Ethan glanced around first before answering. "You didn't hear this from me." That sentence always meant bad news. Several redevelopment contracts under review. Something about payouts tied to zoning approvals. Malcolm frowned. What kind of payouts? Ethan lowered his voice further. Bribery allegations. The word landed heavily. Malcolm immediately thought of the Southwest Redevelopment Corridor, the same project Zarya confronted him about months earlier. His stomach tightened. Who involved? Ethan shrugged quickly. Everybody pretending not to know. That afternoon, nobody concentrated properly. Conversations stopped when certain executives entered rooms. Phones stayed glued to people's hands. Assistants looked nervous. For the first time in years, Malcolm noticed how fragile professional confidence actually looked once money and reputation became threatened simultaneously. 3 days later, local news stations started reporting, officially, questions surrounding redevelopment incentives, possible financial misconduct, internal investigations. Bellamy, Rhodes, and Vale released a carefully worded public statement denying wrongdoing while promising full cooperation. Inside the office, panic spread anyway. And this was where Malcolm learned something ugly about powerful spaces. Loyalty evaporates fast once consequences arrive. The same executives who spent years speaking confidently about company family suddenly communicated through attorneys and risk management teams. People stopped joking in hallways. Lunch invitations disappeared. Even eye contact changed. One senior partner Malcolm defended publicly for years, passed him near the elevators, and barely acknowledged him. That hurt more than Malcolm expected, not because they were close emotionally, because Malcolm finally saw the relationship clearly. Usefulness had always been mistaken for connection there. One evening, Brent called Malcolm into his office after most employees already left for the night. The city skyline glowed behind him through massive glass windows, while rain streaked softly against the building outside. Brent looked exhausted, tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. "Close the door," he muttered. Malcolm obeyed quietly. Brent rubbed both hands over his face before speaking. "There's gonna be internal reviews." Malcolm stayed standing. "Okay. Your name attached to several planning meetings. I followed approved procedures." "I know." But Brent sounded nervous anyway. That mattered. Malcolm crossed his arms slowly. "So what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying legal teams are trying to create distance wherever possible." The sentence hit immediately. Distance, meaning blame was already moving around privately before investigations even finished. Malcolm stared at Brent carefully. "You think they're setting people up?" Brent looked away first. "I think everybody protecting themselves." That answer told Malcolm everything. Driving home through Atlanta traffic later that night, Malcolm felt something unfamiliar settling inside him. Not fear exactly, recognition. For years, he bent himself carefully inside these professional spaces, smoothed his edges, managed perceptions, protected harmony, and now, nobody seemed interested in protecting him at all. At home, the condo felt colder than usual. Malcolm loosened his tie and found himself staring at the empty side of the couch automatically again. He almost called Zarya, not to discuss the scandal, just to hear somebody speak honestly for 5 minutes. Instead, he poured bourbon into a glass and sat alone beside the balcony windows while rain covered Midtown in blurry reflections. His phone stayed silent most of the evening. That bothered him more than he expected. During good times, Malcolm's phone constantly buzzed. Golf invitations, networking dinners, happy hour plans, professional favors disguised as friendship. Now, nothing. Around midnight, Nadine texted him. "You good?" Malcolm stared at the screen before replying. "Not really." Her response came instantly. "You wanna talk?" He almost lied automatically, then stopped himself. "Yeah." She called seconds later. "You sound tired," she said immediately. "I am." "You involved in this mess?" "Not illegally, but—" Malcolm leaned back against the couch heavily. "But I knew enough to know certain things probably weren't right." Nadine stayed quiet briefly. "That bothering you? Or just the fact people abandoning ship now?" The question irritated him because it felt too accurate. "Both." He rubbed one hand across his forehead. "You know what's crazy?" "What?" "I spent years learning how to survive these rooms." His voice sounded hollow suddenly, and the second anything became inconvenient, everybody disappeared emotionally. Nadine sighed softly. "That's because those spaces trained you to confuse access with belonging." The sentence sat with him long after she said it. 2 weeks later, Bellamy, Rhodes, and Vale suspended several employees, pending investigation. Malcolm received the meeting request at 11 in the morning. Human resources, legal representative present, never good signs. The HR woman spoke with rehearsed sympathy while sliding paperwork across the conference table. "We appreciate your cooperation during this process." Meaningless sentence. Corporate language always sounded strangest, during moments pretending to be compassionate. Malcolm signed documents silently, while legal terminology filled the room. Temporary suspension, ethics review, community restitution requirements tied to redevelopment findings. When the meeting ended, nobody walked him out personally. That detail stayed with him later. Years inside that company, years helping projects succeed, years preserving professional relationships carefully. And his exit felt administrative. By evening, Malcolm sat alone inside the condo, staring at the city skyline, while darkness settled slowly across Atlanta. His phone barely moved all night. No coworkers checking in, no executives calling, no invitations, just silence. The kind that exposes truths too clearly. Around 9 o'clock, Corinne called. "You all right?" Malcolm almost answered automatically. Instead, he surprised himself. "No." Corinne stayed quiet for a moment. "Come by tomorrow." "I'm fine, baby." That single word nearly broke him emotionally, because his mother heard exhaustion immediately beneath his voice. Malcolm looked around the condo slowly. The expensive furniture, the polished surfaces, the carefully curated success, none of it felt comforting anymore. The next week his attorney informed him part of the settlement agreement required mandatory community service, connected to housing advocacy outreach programs. The irony almost made Malcolm laugh. "You serious?" It's standard under these circumstances. Standard. Everything sounded standard, once wealthy institutions protected themselves successfully. 3 days later, Malcolm parked outside a small nonprofit legal clinic near the west side. The building sat beside a laundromat and an old beauty supply store with faded signs in the windows. Nothing impressive about it. No polished marble lobby, no skyline view, no catered coffee stations. Malcolm sat inside the car longer than necessary before finally going in. The clinic smelled faintly like old carpet, printer ink, and burnt coffee. Metal folding chairs lined the waiting area, while children colored quietly at a small table near the corner. Nobody looked impressed by him. Nobody cared about Bellamy, Rhodes, and Val. Nobody cared about tailored suits or midtown condos. A receptionist handed Malcolm paperwork, without even glancing up fully. "Sign there." That was it. No recognition, no status, no performance. Oddly enough, the simplicity unsettled him. An older woman wearing reading glasses attached to a chain around her neck approached moments later. "You, Malcolm?" "Yes. I'm Odessa." Her handshake felt brisk and practical. "You know computers?" Malcolm blinked slightly. "Yes." "Good. You organizing housing files." No ceremony, no interest in his resume, no concern about his former title. Just work. For the first time in years, Malcolm entered a room where absolutely nobody cared how impressive he seemed, and standing there beside dented filing cabinets and overworked volunteers, he realized how long it had been since he existed anywhere without performing usefulness first. The clinic moved differently from every professional environment Malcolm had spent the last 15 years inside. Nothing there looked polished. People interrupted each other constantly. Phones rang unanswered for too long. Children cried in waiting areas, while exhausted parents filled out paperwork beside vending machines that only accepted exact change half the time. And somehow, despite all that, the place felt more emotionally honest than Bellamy, Rhodes, and Vale ever had. Odessa ran the clinic with the energy of somebody permanently irritated by inefficiency. "Those folders alphabetical for a reason," she snapped one morning while passing Malcolm's desk. "They are alphabetical." "Then why I found housing records under medical assistance?" Malcolm checked the labels. She was right. He sighed. That was one mistake. One mistake become lawsuit if people homeless long enough. Then she walked away before he could answer. The first few weeks there humbled Malcolm quietly. Nobody cared about his old job title. Nobody cared where he lived. Nobody cared how professionally he spoke. People cared whether forms got processed properly, whether families received callbacks, whether elderly tenants understood legal notices before deadlines expired. Useful work. Immediate work. Not performative work. At first, Malcolm treated the clinic emotionally like temporary punishment. Then something shifted gradually. The stories became harder to ignore. Single mothers sleeping inside relatives' living rooms after rent hikes. Elderly residents confused by redevelopment contracts they barely understood. Families displaced 3 times in 4 years because neighborhoods kept becoming valuable. Every conversation carried consequences more human than the presentations Malcolm used to sit through downtown. One rainy afternoon, Odessa dropped a thick folder onto his desk. "Need those organized before 5. Malcolm flipped through eviction notices and relocation forms while people moved busily around the clinic. A toddler nearby cried because somebody took his crayons. An exhausted man argued softly with a receptionist about missing documents. Coffee burned somewhere in the back office again. Real life. Messy life. Not curated. Around 4 o'clock, the front door opened, and 3 teenagers walked inside laughing loudly enough that several people glanced over automatically. 2 younger boys chased each other toward the waiting chairs while an older girl balanced folders against her hip, trying unsuccessfully to control them. "Sit down before y'all break something," she muttered. Something about her face looked familiar to Malcolm immediately. Not from the clinic. Somewhere else. The girl approached the intake desk while Odessa searched for paperwork nearby. Then she looked directly at Malcolm and paused. Recognition crossed her face instantly. "You used to be married to Miss Zarya, right?" The question hit him harder than expected. Malcolm straightened slightly in the chair. "Yes." The girl smiled warmly. "I knew it." Malcolm frowned softly. "You know Zarya?" The teenager laughed quietly. "Everybody know Miss Zarya." Odessa walked past carrying files. "She one of Zarya's counseling kids from Grady Outreach," Odessa explained casually before disappearing into another office. Counseling kid. The phrase unsettled Malcolm immediately. He remembered late nights years earlier when Zarya came home emotionally exhausted after difficult sessions involving self-harm recovery and unstable home situations. One particular girl especially apologized every time she asked for water. Malcolm looked at the teenager more carefully now. "You doing all right these days?" "Better," she answered honestly. One of the younger boys tugged her sleeve impatiently. "You said vending machine after this." "I know." She handed paperwork toward Malcolm. While he reviewed the forms, the girl leaned against the counter casually. "Miss Zarya helped my grandmother find legal assistance after our apartment building got sold." Malcolm nodded slowly. "She mentioned doing housing outreach." The girl smiled. "She do everything." There wasn't exaggeration in her voice, just certainty. Then casually, while helping the younger boy untangle headphone wires, the teenager added, "She saved my life for real." Malcolm stopped turning pages. The clinic noise continued around him normally. Phones, printers, conversations. But for a second, everything sounded farther away emotionally. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. The girl shrugged, like she wasn't saying anything dramatic. "After my suicide attempt," she glanced toward the younger boys before lowering her voice slightly. "Everybody kept talking to me like I was broken after that. Miss Zarya didn't." Malcolm swallowed hard. She talked regular to me, the girl continued, like I still belonged somewhere. The simplicity of the statement wrecked him internally, not because Zarya being compassionate surprised him, because the impact sounded so permanent, so real. The younger boy interrupted again. You said snacks. Calm down. The teenager laughed and ruffled his hood before looking back toward Malcolm. You should come to one of her workshops sometime. She be helping people for real. Be helping people for real. The sentence stayed with Malcolm the rest of the evening. After they left, he sat staring at the paperwork longer than necessary. All those years at Bellamy, Rhodes, and Val. All the meetings. All the networking dinners. All the expensive watches and polished conference rooms. And nobody would ever describe him that way, not honestly. Useful? Yes. Successful? Sure. Respected professionally? Sometimes. But meaningful? That felt different. Around closing time, Odessa dropped another stack of folders near Malcolm's desk. You zoning out? Just thinking. Dangerous activity. Malcolm smiled faintly. Then, after a long silence, he asked, People always talk about Zarya like that around here? Odessa adjusted her glasses. Like what? Like she changed their lives. Odessa looked genuinely confused by the question. Because she did. Simple answer. No dramatic praise. No inspirational tone. Just fact. She remembered people, Odessa continued while sorting papers, that matter more than folks realize. Malcolm leaned back quietly. Remember people, not impress people, not manage people, not network with people. Remember them. The distinction bothered him because he suddenly realized how much of his own adult life had centered around perception instead of presence. That night, Malcolm stopped at a small grocery store on the drive home. Nothing fancy. Fluorescent lights, tired cashiers, old radio station playing softly overhead. While standing near checkout, he overheard two women discussing rising rent prices nearby. One woman mentioned a housing advocate helping her cousin avoid eviction. Miss Zarya? The other asked immediately. Yeah, that's her. Again. Everywhere. Malcolm stood there holding frozen meals and bottled water while hearing his ex-wife's name move naturally through the city, attached to relief, trust, and survival. Meanwhile, most people from his old professional world stopped calling the second his usefulness became complicated. That realization sat heavily with him all the way home. Later that night, he stood inside the condo kitchen staring absent-mindedly at the expensive espresso machine he once thought symbolized adulthood properly. The place still looked beautiful, still clean, still impressive. But now Malcolm noticed how little emotional life existed inside it. No community, no memories attached to neighbors, no people dropping by unexpectedly, just carefully maintained isolation. He opened the refrigerator and stared blankly at leftovers before closing it again untouched. Then, without fully understanding why, Malcolm suddenly remembered something Zarya once said during one of their late-night conversations years earlier. Some people spend their whole lives trying to become admired, when what they actually want is to feel valuable. Back then he thought she was speaking generally. Standing alone in the kitchen now, Malcolm finally understood she might have been talking about him the entire time. By the time Malcolm started volunteering regularly at the clinic, instead of only completing assigned hours, Atlanta had settled into one of those long, wet spring seasons where rain seemed permanently attached to the city. Sidewalks stayed damp for days. Traffic moved worse than usual. Everybody carried umbrellas they forgot in restaurants afterward. Most Saturdays, the clinic partnered with churches and neighborhood organizations to host housing workshops for residents dealing with rent increases, relocation notices, and redevelopment confusion. Malcolm usually handled paperwork now. Quiet work, filing records, explaining forms, helping elderly residents understand legal language designed to confuse them intentionally. He still avoided speaking too much during workshops, partly because he preferred listening lately, partly because shame still sat inside him heavier than he admitted openly. That Saturday morning, Odessa handed him a folding table and pointed toward the community center entrance. You setting up registration. I thought I was organizing files. You got hands. Congratulations. Malcolm almost smiled. The community center sat near West End beside an old church with faded brick walls and a parking lot full of potholes holding leftover rainwater. Inside, volunteers moved tables around, while somebody tested microphones badly near the stage. Children ran through rows of folding chairs until exhausted parents started threatening consequences loudly. Ordinary chaos. The kind Malcolm once avoided instinctively. Now he found himself strangely comforted by it. He carried stacks of housing packets toward the registration area, while rain hammered steadily against the roof overhead. You got the blue folders mixed with intake forms. Odessa sounded offended by paperwork personally. They looked identical. That's because you don't respect organization. Malcolm laughed softly and fixed the stacks. Then he heard it. Laughter. Not loud, not dramatic, but familiar enough that his body recognized it before his thoughts fully caught up. He turned instinctively. Zarya stood near the far wall, helping an elderly woman fill out forms beside the coffee station. For a second, Malcolm forgot to move. Not because she looked impossibly different, because she looked peaceful. That hit harder. Her curls were longer now, pulled loosely behind one side of her face. She wore wide-leg linen pants, sneakers with faint paint marks near the soles, and a dark green sweater pushed casually to her elbows. Nothing expensive, nothing performative. Still, she carried herself differently now, lighter, like some invisible pressure had finally left her shoulders. Zarya looked up while handing paperwork back to the elderly woman. Their eyes met immediately. Recognition crossed her face, then warmth, not longing. That distinction hurt Malcolm more than expected. Malcolm. Her voice sounded calm, comfortable. He walked over slowly. Hey. For half a second, neither knew what to do physically. Handshake? Hug? Distance? Zarya solved it first by touching his arm lightly. Small gesture, familiar enough to sting emotionally. You volunteering here now? She asked. At first, it was court-ordered. She laughed softly. Well, growth arrives however it can. The old instinct returned immediately. Malcolm suddenly wanted to impress her somehow, sound wiser, look transformed already. But another part of him felt too tired for performance now. So instead, he told the truth. I think Odessa hates me. She hates everybody equally. That's her love language. He laughed. And for one dangerous second, the conversation felt easy enough to resemble before. Then a volunteer called Zarya's name from across the room. Coming? She answered before turning back toward Malcolm. You look tired. The honesty caught him off guard. I probably am. You sleeping? Sometimes. Zarya studied his face quietly for a moment, not judging, just noticing. She always noticed. The difference now was that her observations no longer carried emotional urgency underneath them. That realization unsettled Malcolm deeply. Years earlier, if he looked exhausted, she would have moved emotionally toward him automatically. Now, she looked concerned in the same grounded way she probably looked concerned for anybody struggling. The workshop started filling quickly. Families carrying folders, older residents asking questions anxiously, young couples trying to understand rising rent notices. Malcolm spent most of the afternoon helping people complete intake forms while rain battered the windows steadily. Several times he caught himself searching for Zarya unconsciously across the room. She moved through the workshop naturally, helping one woman understand tenant protections, kneeling beside an elderly man so he could hear her better, remembering children's names from previous events. Nobody around her looked intimidated. People relaxed near her. That difference kept bothering Malcolm, because he realized how rarely people truly relaxed around him without some layer of performance involved. Near closing time, the storm outside got worse. Thunder shook the windows, while volunteers stacked chairs reluctantly. Several people stayed inside waiting for rain to calm before leaving. Malcolm found himself beside the coffee station refilling paper cups when Zarya walked over carrying leftover folders. You still hate ginger tea? She asked suddenly. He blinked. What? You used to act personally offended by ginger tea. Malcolm laughed unexpectedly. I still do. You dramatic. You drank it like medicine every night. It worked. The familiarity of the conversation hit him harder than he expected, not because it felt romantic, because it felt lived in, like muscle memory. Rain hammered loudly overhead, while volunteers packed supplies around them. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Malcolm looked down into his coffee cup. "I owe you an apology." Zarya sighed softly, almost immediately. "Malcolm, no. Seriously. You apologized already. Not correctly." She leaned against the counter. "That's not the issue." "Then what is?" Zarya looked toward the rain-covered windows for a second before answering. "You still think healing depends on you understanding everything perfectly first." The statement confused him. "What does that mean?" "It means," she searched carefully for words, "you keep trying to intellectually solve emotional damage after it already happened." Malcolm stayed quiet, because, honestly, that sounded exactly like him. "I know I failed you publicly sometimes," he admitted quietly. "Sometimes? Fair correction." He nodded slowly. "More than sometimes." Zarya folded her arms lightly. "You know what hurt most?" Malcolm looked at her. "You made me feel emotionally expensive." His chest tightened immediately. "What?" "In those rooms with your coworkers, your investors, your professional friends." She paused briefly. "Every time I spoke honestly, I could feel you calculating fallout before you even responded." Malcolm swallowed hard. Rain continued beating steadily outside. "You don't understand how much pressure those spaces carried for me," he said quietly. "I do understand." "No, I mean, Malcolm." Her voice stayed gentle. "I understood you long before you understood yourself." That sentence landed painfully, because deep down, he knew it was true. She always saw the fear underneath his behavior before he admitted it existed. For a moment, neither spoke. Across the room, Odessa argued with another volunteer about missing extension cords. Life continued normally around them. Finally, Malcolm asked the question sitting inside him all afternoon. "Are you happy?" Zarya considered it seriously before answering. "I'm peaceful." The response hurt in a clean adult way, because peace sounded earned, not temporary. "You don't miss us?" he asked quietly, before stopping himself. Too vulnerable, too late. But Zarya didn't flinch. "Of course I do." Relief hit him instantly before she continued. "But missing somebody and needing to return to them aren't always the same thing." There it was, the truth he'd avoided fully accepting. She loved him once. Maybe part of her still did. But her emotional life no longer revolved around his potential growth. That chapter had ended for her already. Thunder rolled outside while volunteers headed toward exits carefully between rainbursts. Malcolm rubbed one hand against the back of his neck. "I think I spent years trying to become acceptable." Zarya nodded softly. "I know. And somewhere along the way," he laughed once bitterly, "I forgot what I actually sounded like." Her face softened immediately then, not with pity, something gentler. "You're not beyond repair," she said quietly. The sentence settled deeply inside him, because for the first time since the divorce, Malcolm realized she wasn't speaking like somebody waiting for him anymore. She was simply telling the truth, and somehow, that made the words matter more. By late summer, Malcolm had stopped counting his volunteer hours entirely. The clinic became part of his routine now, not punishment, not image repair, just life. 3 mornings a week, he helped residents review redevelopment paperwork before legal consultations. Some afternoons he drove elderly tenants to housing offices, because half the city's online appointment systems barely worked for people over 60. The work exhausted him differently than architecture ever had. Cleaner exhaustion. Nobody cared about presentations there. Nobody rewarded polished language. People cared whether you returned calls when promised. That simplicity kept unsettling Malcolm, because he realized how much of his previous life depended on perception management. One Thursday evening, Nadine called while Malcolm carried grocery bags into the condo. "You coming Saturday?" "To what?" "The cookout." Malcolm sighed immediately. Why every family event got smoke damage and folding chairs? Because black people invented joy under bad conditions. "Be there at 3. Before he could answer, she hung up. Saturday arrived humid enough to make Atlanta feel sticky before noon. Malcolm almost didn't go. He stood inside the bedroom staring at shirts too long, before finally grabbing a plain gray t-shirt instead of the usual button-down. Small decision. Still unusual for him, By the time he arrived at Nadine's house, music already drifted across the neighborhood, while kids chased each other through sprinklers near the sidewalk. Same kind of gathering as always. Paper plates, coolers full of soda, plastic patio chairs sinking slightly into grass. But Malcolm noticed something different immediately. He wasn't scanning the space for approval anymore. No instinctive adjusting. No careful voice management. Just observation. Nadine spotted him near the gate. Well, look who decided to reconnect with humanity. Relax. She hugged him quickly before narrowing her eyes. You actually dressed normal today. Apparently, everybody critique me recreationally now. Growth. Before Malcolm could answer, laughter floated from the back patio. Familiar laughter. His chest tightened automatically. Zarya sat near the folding tables beside two older women, arguing about church choir politics. She wore ripped jeans, sandals, and a loose white shirt tied casually near the waist. No makeup besides lip gloss, hair pinned up unevenly because of the heat, and somehow, she looked more comfortable inside herself than Malcolm had ever seen during their marriage. That realization hit immediately. Not prettier, not transformed, free. She noticed him seconds later and smiled warmly. Not awkward, not emotionally loaded, just genuine warmth. Hey, stranger, she called. Malcolm walked over, trying not to overthink his posture suddenly. Hey, one of the older women pointed toward him immediately. This the ex-husband? Malcolm nearly choked on his drink. Zarya burst out laughing. Auntie, please. What? The woman shrugged. I'm old. I ask direct questions. Malcolm laughed, despite himself. The awkwardness dissolved quickly after that. For most of the afternoon, he drifted naturally through conversations, while music played from cheap speakers near the grill. Renelle argued loudly about basketball. Kids fought over popsicles. Somebody burned hot dogs badly enough for smoke to rise across half the yard. Normal family chaos. At one point, Malcolm stood near the cooler, listening to Zarya debate movie endings with Nadine, and suddenly realized something strange. She wasn't monitoring herself anymore around him. During their marriage, especially near the end, Zarya often measured her honesty carefully depending on Malcolm's mood or environment. Now, she sounded loose again, comfortable disagreeing, comfortable laughing loudly, comfortable taking up emotional space fully. Nadine stepped beside Malcolm while opening another soda. You see it now? What? She's home inside herself again. The sentence landed quietly, because Malcolm understood exactly what she meant. Across the yard, Zarya sat with one leg tucked beneath herself, while talking animatedly to Renelle about neighborhood redevelopment. No hesitation, no emotional shrinking, no watching Malcolm first before speaking. And suddenly Malcolm remembered all the subtle moments during their marriage where she did exactly that, checking his expression before finishing thoughts at work dinners, softening opinions around certain people, choosing silence occasionally just to avoid tension later. He noticed it now because the absence looked so obvious. Later that evening, the crowd thinned gradually as families headed home before another storm rolled through Atlanta. The air smelled like charcoal, citronella candles, and summer rain waiting nearby. Malcolm found Zarya alone briefly near the back steps, rubbing lotion into her hands. Small familiar gesture, the kind he once watched almost every night without realizing ordinary intimacy could disappear permanently. You hiding? He asked softly, recovering socially. He smiled and sat beside her, leaving enough space not to assume closeness automatically. For a few moments both listened to distant music, drifting from another yard nearby. Then Zarya glanced sideways at him. You seem calmer lately. Malcolm laughed quietly. I think I got humbled professionally enough to stop performing constantly. That'll do it. He rubbed his palms together slowly. You know something weird? What? I used to think everybody else expected all that from me. All what? The editing, the managing, the carefulness. Zarya stayed quiet, letting him continue. But lately, he shook his head slightly. I'm realizing a lot of that pressure lived inside me long before anybody actually applied it. She looked at him carefully then, not surprised, almost relieved. That's a painful realization, she admitted softly. Yeah. Another silence settled naturally between them, not tense this time, Adult. The kind built from surviving disappointment honestly. Finally, Malcolm looked over at her. I owe you more apologies than I gave. Zarya sighed softly, though not impatiently. Malcolm. No, listen. He swallowed hard. You were trying to love me honestly, while I kept treating honesty like social risk management. She stared ahead toward the darkening yard. I know you loved me. The sentence caught him off guard immediately. Then why did it feel like I lost everything anyway? Zarya thought for several seconds before answering. Because love can still damage people when fear controls it. No accusation in her voice. No bitterness. Just truth. Malcolm nodded slowly. That's fair. She glanced at him briefly. You know what changed after I left? What? I stopped feeling emotionally monitored all the time. That hurt. Not because she said it cruelly. Because Malcolm remembered countless moments proving it true. Work dinners, fundraisers, networking events. Tiny hesitations accumulating quietly over years. Zarya rested her elbows lightly against her knees. For a while after the divorce, I kept waiting to feel guilty for healing. She admitted. Malcolm looked at her carefully. But eventually, I realized something. She smiled sadly. I wasn't grieving you anymore. I was grieving the version of us I kept hoping would finally feel emotionally safe. The honesty landed deep. Still, for the first time, Malcolm didn't feel defensive hearing it. Just sad. Sad for both of them. That makes sense, he admitted quietly. Thunder rumbled faintly somewhere across the city. People inside the house started gathering leftover containers before rain arrived. Malcolm watched Zarya for a moment. Really watched her. Not as his ex-wife. Not as lost possibility. As herself. Grounded. Open. Present. And suddenly he understood something devastating clearly. For years he thought success meant becoming acceptable inside rooms that barely cared about him personally. Meanwhile, the people who genuinely loved him never asked him to become smaller at all. He did that himself. You know the worst part? He asked quietly. Zarya looked over. I think I spent so much time trying not to get rejected. He laughed softly, without humor. I rejected parts of myself first. Zarya's expression softened deeply then. Not triumphant. Compassionate. That usually starts young, she said gently. Malcolm nodded. Yeah. Rain finally started falling lightly across the backyard. Somebody inside yelled for everyone to grab chairs before the storm got worse. Zarya stood first and brushed grass from her jeans. Then before heading inside, she paused beside him. I don't need apologies anymore, Malcolm. The sentence could have sounded cruel in another voice. From her, it sounded peaceful. He looked up slowly. Why not? Because I already healed. No drama, no emotional punishment, just honesty. And strangely enough, hearing that didn't break Malcolm the way it once would have. Because for the first time, he understood healing wasn't rejection. It was release. Not just for her. Eventually, maybe for him too. Nearly a year after the divorce, Malcolm moved out of the Midtown condo. Not because he absolutely had to financially. Because the place no longer fit his life honestly. Too much empty space. Too much performance attached to it. Too many rooms designed more for appearance than living. The new apartment sat inside a quieter brick complex near Decatur, above a family-owned insurance office, and across from a small Mexican restaurant that played music too loudly on weekends. The building wasn't impressive, which oddly made Malcolm breathe easier. The kitchen barely fit two people comfortably. The bathroom pipes knocked softly whenever neighbors showered late at night. One bedroom window stuck halfway during humid weather. Real place, lived-in place, not curated. The first morning there, Malcolm stood barefoot drinking coffee while listening to traffic and birds outside simultaneously. No skyline view, no expensive silence, just neighborhood sounds. A woman downstairs arguing affectionately with her son about missing school shoes. Delivery trucks backing into narrow alleys. Somebody grilling meat before noon, for reasons Malcolm respected deeply. For the first time in years, his home felt connected to actual life around it. The clinic remained part of his routine too, not volunteer hours anymore. Commitment. Odessa trusted him enough now to handle intake meetings alone some mornings, though she still criticized his filing system aggressively. You alphabetize like somebody emotionally distracted, she muttered one afternoon. That doesn't even mean anything. It means, fix those folders. Malcolm laughed and reorganized them. Months earlier, he would have found the work beneath him intellectually. That embarrassed him now, because lately, the most meaningful parts of his week involved ordinary usefulness. Helping elderly residents complete online forms, driving donated box fans to tenants during heat waves, explaining lease agreements without making people feel stupid. Nobody applauded those moments. That was part of why they mattered. One Tuesday afternoon, Malcolm sat beside an older man confused about housing assistance paperwork. I don't understand none of this, the man admitted quietly. Malcolm pulled the chair closer. Let's go line by line. An hour later, the paperwork finally made sense enough for the man to relax visibly. Before leaving, he squeezed Malcolm's shoulder once. Appreciate you taking time. Simple sentence. Still, it stayed with Malcolm the entire day. At Bellamy, Rhodes, and Vale, appreciation usually arrived attached to contracts, promotions, leverage, or visibility. This felt different. Direct, human, no performance attached. Corinne noticed the changes too. By retirement age, she finally stopped pretending exhaustion was temporary. Malcolm started driving her to doctor appointments twice a month, after she admitted night driving strained her eyes lately. The first time he showed up early outside her apartment carrying breakfast biscuits and coffee, Corinne squinted suspiciously before getting inside the car. What you want? Malcolm laughed. I can't be nice? You can. It just usually come with agenda. Wow. She smiled faintly, while adjusting her seatbelt. You happier lately? The observation surprised him. I wouldn't say happier. Lighter then. That felt more accurate. Not healed completely. Not transformed magically. Just less divided internally. One afternoon, while helping Corinne organize old paperwork at her apartment, Malcolm found a faded school photo from middle school tucked inside a storage box. Tiny Malcolm, oversized collared shirt, nervous smile. Corinne looked over his shoulder. You hated that school picture. My ears looked crazy. No. She shook her head softly. That was around when you first started trying to become acceptable to everybody. Malcolm looked at the photo quietly. Even back then he remembered monitoring himself constantly. Voice, posture, expression, performance started young. You know something sad? He admitted. What? I spent so many years trying to sound safe. He laughed quietly. I don't think I realized how tired I was until recently. Corinne folded another stack of papers carefully. That kind of tired sneak up on people. The apartment smelled like bleach and fried onions again, same way it always had. Comforting smell, familiar smell, not impressive, just home. Later that evening, Malcolm stopped at the grocery store after dropping Corinne off. Near checkout, one cashier recognized him from the housing clinic. You the paperwork guy, right? Malcolm blinked. I guess. You helped my aunt with her rental appeal. He smiled slightly. Oh, how's she doing? Still complaining constantly, so probably healthy. Both laughed. The interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds. Still, Malcolm noticed something afterward while walking back toward his car. People were starting to recognize him now for presence instead of status. That felt unfamiliar and strangely emotional. The old version of Malcolm chased visibility professionally because he thought admiration created security. Now he found himself caring more about consistency, returning calls, showing up when promised, remembering details people mentioned casually, ordinary things. One rainy evening, Odessa caught Malcolm staying late organizing housing packets after everybody else already left. You know nobody forcing you stay. I know. She studied him suspiciously. You trying become employee? Malcolm laughed. Absolutely not. You terrorize staff. Correct. She stacked folders beside him quietly for a moment before speaking again. You changed since first day. Malcolm looked up. How? Less shiny. He burst out laughing immediately. That might be the rudest compliment anybody ever gave me. Odessa shrugged. Shiny people, usually useless once pressure hit. She pointed toward him with a folder. You finally learning how to sit still long enough to become dependable. Dependable. That word mattered more to Malcolm now than impressive ever had. Later that night, he sat alone inside the smaller apartment, eating takeout directly from containers, while rain tapped softly against the windows. The place still got lonely sometimes. He still missed Zarya unexpectedly, still reached for thoughts he wanted to tell her occasionally. But the loneliness felt cleaner now, not desperate, not performative, just honest. Malcolm looked around the apartment slowly. The mismatched furniture, the crowded bookshelves, the sound of neighbors arguing faintly downstairs. Life, messy, ordinary life. And for the first time in years, Malcolm realized something quietly important. He wasn't spending every moment editing himself anymore. He laughed differently now, spoke more directly, paused less before answering questions, not because he became fearless overnight, because exhaustion finally outweighed performance. Outside, rain continued falling steadily across Atlanta. Malcolm leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes briefly. The life he built looked smaller now from the outside, less polished, less impressive. And somehow, for the first time in a very long time, it actually felt like his. The first time Odessa asked Malcolm to speak publicly at a housing workshop, he thought she was joking. "You got wrong person." "I got correct lungs and available body," Odessa replied while carrying folding chairs toward the church basement. "Congratulations." "I'm serious." "So am I." Malcolm frowned. "I'm not good at that kind of thing." Odessa stopped walking and looked at him flatly. "You spent 15 years talking in front of investors and city officials. That's different." "How?" "Because those rooms had rules." Malcolm understood. Professional language, careful posture, controlled emotion. Community workshops felt harder. Real people asked direct questions there. Real frustration lived inside those conversations. Nobody cared about polished corporate phrasing. Odessa must have sensed the hesitation on his face, because her expression softened slightly. "Folks don't need perfection," she said. "They need clarity." That sentence followed Malcolm the entire morning. The workshop took place inside a church fellowship hall near Vine City. Metal fans pushed warm air across rows of folding chairs, while volunteers arranged bottled water beside registration tables. Residents filled the room slowly. Elderly couples carrying folders full of overdue notices. Young parents balancing children against tired shoulders. Men in work boots, arriving straight from construction jobs. Nobody looked impressed by titles there. People looked worried. That changed how Malcolm spoke once Odessa finally shoved him toward the front. "Tell them what redevelopment paperwork actually means," she whispered. "That's not public speaking. That's called helping." Then she walked away before he could argue further. Malcolm stood near the microphone, adjusting it awkwardly, while conversations quieted around the room. For half a second, old instincts returned immediately. Sound polished. Sound safe. Sound impressive. Then he looked at the faces waiting for answers and realized performance would insult them. So instead, he told the truth plainly. Most of these documents are written to confuse people on purpose. The room got still instantly. Malcolm glanced down at the papers in his hands. If you don't fully understand what you're signing, ask questions before agreeing to anything, especially relocation timelines and temporary assistance agreements. People started nodding, actually listening. A woman near the front raised her hand. "What if they already pressured us into signing?" Malcolm paused briefly. Old Malcolm would have answered carefully, legally, detached. Instead, "Then somebody should have explained your rights better before that happened." The honesty changed the room immediately. Afterward, residents lined up with questions that lasted nearly an hour longer than scheduled. One older man shook Malcolm's hand tightly before leaving. "You explain this better than my own landlord." Another woman thanked him for translating legal language into normal people words. None of the compliments sounded performative. That difference still affected Malcolm emotionally. Weeks passed, then months. Gradually, Malcolm became one of the regular faces at workshops across Atlanta. Not inspirational speaker regular, not leadership regular, dependable regular. He arrived early, stayed late, remembered people's situations. That mattered more than charisma there. One afternoon, while helping residents organize appeal paperwork, Malcolm overheard two women talking quietly nearby. "That man helped my cousin avoid eviction." "Which one?" "The tall one, always carrying coffee." Malcolm smiled faintly, without looking up. The tall one, always carrying coffee. Not architect, not executive, not project manager. Just recognizable through usefulness. That realization kept changing him slowly. Meanwhile, Corinne officially retired from Grady after 32 years. The family organized a small retirement celebration inside the fellowship hall of her church. Nothing fancy. Sheet cake from Publix, dollar store decorations. Church ladies arguing over table placement like national security depended on it. By the time Malcolm arrived carrying folding tables from storage, half the room already smelled like fried chicken and lemon pound cake. "You late," Nadine announced immediately. "I was 10 minutes late." "That's late in Black family time." Renelle pointed toward the decorations. "Go help before aunties start fighting spiritually." Malcolm laughed and carried the tables across the room. For most of the evening, former co-workers, church friends and relatives drifted toward Corinne sharing stories. Not one person mentioned awards first, not promotions, not overtime hours, not job titles. Instead, people remembered rides home after surgery, extra meals during difficult months, phone calls during funerals, small kindnesses Malcolm never even knew about. One former nurse wiped tears while hugging Corinne. "You stayed with me after my miscarriage when everybody else got awkward," she said quietly. Another woman laughed, remembering how Corinne secretly paid utility bills for a younger coworker once. "You made hard seasons feel survivable." Malcolm stood near the back wall holding paper plates while listening carefully. That sentence stayed with him. Made hard seasons feel survivable. That was what people actually remembered. Not polish, not status, presence. During dinner, Nadine nudged Malcolm lightly while watching church members surround Corinne near the cake table. "You finally get it now? What? All them years you chased impressive." She gestured around the room. "This, what lasts." Malcolm looked around slowly. Corinne laughing loudly beside church friends. People hugging each other near folding chairs. Children running between tables while adults yelled fake threats after them. Community, real community, messy and imperfect and loud, nothing curated, and somehow emotionally richer than every executive dinner Malcolm ever attended, combined. Later that evening, Malcolm helped Corinne carry leftover trays toward her apartment car. "You tired?" he asked, my knees staging protest. He smiled and grabbed another container. Corinne looked at him carefully while unlocking the trunk. "You different lately." "Everybody keeps saying that." "Because it's true." Malcolm leaned against the car briefly. "I think I spent too much of my life trying to become respectable." Corinne snorted softly. "You already were respectable." "Didn't feel like it." His mother closed the trunk slowly. "That because you confused achievement with worth." The sentence landed quietly, not painfully anymore. Just true. On the drive home, Malcolm passed through neighborhoods Bellamy, Rhodes, and Vale, once discussed mostly through investment language. Now he noticed different details automatically. People sitting on porches, corner stores surviving somehow, grandmothers watching children through screen doors. Human life, not development zones. At a red light near West End, Malcolm remembered something Zarya once told him during their marriage after one of his work dinners. People can feel when somebody enters a room already trying to manage perception. Back then he felt defensive hearing it. Now he understood what she meant completely. Management creates distance. Presence creates trust. By the time Malcolm reached his apartment, rain had started again lightly across the city. Inside, the smaller space felt warm, despite cluttered bookshelves and mismatched lamps. Not perfect. Real. Malcolm set leftover cake containers on the counter and sat quietly for a moment, listening to rain against the windows. His life still carried regret, still carried loss. But lately, the regret felt less like punishment and more like education. Painful education. The kind adulthood sometimes charges people for too late. His phone buzzed suddenly on the table. Message from Odessa. "You coming Thursday or not?" Malcolm smiled immediately. "Yes." Her reply came seconds later. "Good. People trust you now. Don't make it weird." He laughed softly and set the phone down. Trust. That word still startled him sometimes. Because Malcolm finally understood something he wished he learned years earlier. People rarely remember who sounded the most impressive during good seasons. They remember who helped them breathe during difficult ones. The rain started just after 8, not heavy at first, just enough to leave Atlanta streets shining beneath traffic lights, while people hurried toward parking garages holding jackets over their heads. Malcolm stood near the produce section of the same Kroger off Ponce de Leon, where he once froze holding Zarya's ginger tea months earlier. Only this time, he wasn't standing still emotionally. That difference mattered. He carried a grocery basket with normal things inside now. Tomatoes, coffee creamer, chicken broth, a bag of lemons. Odessa swore cured everything except bad decision-making. Ordinary life. The store smelled faintly like wet umbrellas and bakery bread, while quiet R&B played overhead through old speakers. Near the checkout lanes, a tired father negotiated unsuccessfully with a toddler demanding candy. 2 nurses still wearing scrubs debated frozen dinner prices beside the refrigerators. Life continuing normally, Malcolm had finally learned how to exist inside that normalcy again without feeling haunted every second. Not healed perfectly, just steadier. He turned down the tea aisle almost absent-mindedly, then stopped. Zarya stood halfway down the aisle, comparing soup labels, while rainwater still clung lightly to the sleeves of her denim jacket. For one strange second, neither moved. Not shock, exactly. Recognition, familiarity, time. Zarya looked up first. "Well," she said softly, "you still emotionally processing groceries?" Malcolm laughed immediately. Real laugh. Easy laugh. That joke really surviving long-term, huh? It deserves longevity. He walked closer, slowly. "You doing all right?" "Yeah." She lifted the basket slightly. "Trying to survive soup season. Atlanta weather, don't know what month it is anymore. Never does." They stood there smiling awkwardly for half a second, before both laughing again at the same time. Not romantic movie laughter, adult familiarity, the kind shared between people who once knew each other deeply enough to predict reactions before words fully formed. Zarya looked good, not glamorous, real, hair wrapped loosely back because of the rain, minimal makeup, tired eyes, in the honest way people helping too many others usually carried. And standing there under grocery store lights, Malcolm realized something important, quietly. He no longer felt desperate around her. Sad sometimes? Yes. Grateful? Definitely. But not desperate. That surprised him. "You still at the clinic?" she asked while placing soup cans carefully into her basket. "Yeah. How's Odessa terrorizing staff these days?" "She called me emotionally alphabetical last week." Zarya burst out laughing immediately. "That sounds exactly like her." Malcolm leaned lightly against the shelf. "She talks about you all the time. That woman gossips professionally. You helped a lot of people." Zarya shrugged softly. "So do you now." The sentence settled differently than compliments once did. Years earlier, Malcolm would have instinctively minimized it, or redirected attention. Now he simply nodded once. "I'm trying. That counts." Rain intensified outside, drumming harder against storefront windows now. Several shoppers paused near the entrance watching the storm build. Malcolm looked toward the front of the store. "You parked far?" "Unfortunately." "Same." For a few moments, silence settled between them comfortably. Not empty silence, rested silence. Then Zarya glanced sideways at him. "You seem more here lately." Malcolm smiled faintly. "That might be the nicest way anybody ever told me I used to live emotionally disconnected." "You did." "Fair." He looked down briefly at the basket in his hands. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I spent years thinking maturity meant managing myself constantly." He shook his head softly. "Turns out half the time, I was just afraid." Zarya listened quietly, not analyzing him anymore, not trying to pull emotional honesty out of him, just listening. That difference mattered too. "I think I understand now why you got tired," he admitted. The honesty came easier lately, not because he mastered vulnerability suddenly, because exhaustion finally removed his interest in pretending. Zarya's expression softened. "You were carrying a lot before we even met." "Yeah," he laughed quietly. "I just kept charging everybody else emotional rent for it." That made her smile sadly, maybe a little Nearby, somebody dropped a glass jar hard enough for the sound to echo across the aisle. Employees sighed in exhausted unison. Normal life, continuing around them again. Malcolm looked at Zarya carefully. I used to think losing you was the worst thing that happened to me. Her eyes stayed on him quietly. But honestly, he exhaled slowly. I think losing myself happened first. I just didn't notice until afterward. The sentence hung gently between them. No dramatic reaction, just truth finally arriving on time. Zarya stepped slightly closer then, close enough for familiarity, not possession. I hope you know something, she said softly. What? You were never hard to love. Malcolm swallowed hard immediately. Then why did everything fall apart? Because being loved and knowing how to live honestly inside that love aren't always the same thing. The answer hurt, but cleanly now, not like punishment, more like understanding arriving late. Rain hammered harder outside, while store employees rolled caution signs near the entrance. Malcolm looked at her for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Not just for specific moments, for how exhausting I became emotionally. Zarya studied him carefully, then nodded once. I know. No bitterness, no reopening wounds, just acknowledgement. That maturity almost broke his heart, more than anger would have. A loudspeaker announced, closing time, approaching in 30 minutes. People around them started moving quicker through aisles. Zarya adjusted the basket against her hip. You still hate ginger tea? Absolutely. Growth got limits, I guess. They laughed softly again. Then, another quiet pause arrived. Different this time. Final somehow, not because they stopped loving each other completely, because both finally understood love alone wasn't the missing ingredient back then. Malcolm noticed she still rubbed her thumb lightly against basket handles, when thinking deeply, still tilted her head before difficult honesty, still carried warmth naturally into ordinary spaces. Some things remained familiar forever. Zarya glanced toward the rain-covered windows near checkout. I should probably head out before Atlanta flood season starts. Yeah, neither moved immediately. Then Malcolm surprised himself, not by reaching desperately, not by asking for another chance, by accepting the moment honestly. I'm glad you're doing well, he said. Zarya smiled softly. I'm glad you finally seem peaceful. That word again. Peaceful. Maybe adulthood wasn't about becoming impressive enough to avoid rejection. Maybe it was learning how to stop abandoning yourself, just to remain accepted. Zarya stepped forward first and hugged him. Not romantically, not distantly either. Familiar embrace. Warm. Real. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly. Years of memory moved through him all at once. Late-night drives, kitchen conversations, quiet laughter, damage growth loss. And underneath all of it, gratitude. When they pulled apart, Zarya rested one hand briefly against his arm. I hope you build a life you don't have to abandon yourself to maintain. The sentence landed softly. Completely. Malcolm nodded slowly. I'm trying to already. I know. Then she grabbed her basket and started toward checkout lanes, while rain battered the windows harder outside. Malcolm watched her go quietly, not collapsing emotionally this time, not reaching after what already ended, just understanding. Finally, understanding. Because the real tragedy had never been simply losing Zarya. It was how many years Malcolm spent disconnecting from himself before anybody ever left. Outside, rain covered Atlanta in silver reflections, while shoppers hurried through parking lot puddles beneath glowing signs. Malcolm grabbed his groceries and headed toward the exit calmly. The automatic doors opened. Cool rain air touched his face. And for the first time in a very long while, silence no longer felt like punishment. It just felt honest.